The whispers started quietly at first, just rumors, murmurs of distrust. But what began as a faint stir soon erupted into an unstoppable force. Secret societies, those powerful, elusive orders, believed they were untouchable. They had the wealth, the influence, and the secrecy that made them seem invincible. Yet, beneath their impenetrable walls, something even more dangerous was growing. It wasn't the elite who brought them down. It was the nobodies, the common people, who, through nothing more than whispers, suspicion, and small acts of defiance, began to erode the foundations of these secret orders. The power of the silent, unseen rebellion shifted history, and it all started with them. In the depths of history, some of the most profound shifts were triggered not by kings or warriors, but by ordinary people whose actions went unnoticed by the world. This is the untold story of the downfall of secret societies, those shadowy, enigmatic orders that wielded immense power for centuries. We've always been told that these organizations were undone by grand betrayals, by elite traitors or political conspiracies that involved only the powerful. But what if that's only half the story? What if the true reason these secret societies fell had little to do with the moves of kings and emperors, but was instead the work of invisible hands, commoners, peasants, and everyday citizens whose impact we barely recognize? The collapse of the Templars, the dissolution of the Illuminati, the slow crumbling of the Freemasons, all of these monumental events were not only the result of the inner workings of political elite, but also the quiet subversion from the common folk. It wasn't just the sword of a knight or the pen of a monarch that brought them down. It was the whispers of the powerless, the unseen resistance, the unnoticed rebellion of those who had nothing to lose but their silence. The fall of the Templars is perhaps the most striking example of this phenomenon. On the night of October 13, 1307, the most powerful knights of Europe were dragged from their beds, arrested on charges of heresy, and ultimately executed or imprisoned for life. The event was officially orchestrated by King Philip IV of France, who was deep in debt to the order and sought to seize their wealth. But even though the king and the pope were the visible faces of this dramatic event, the cracks in the foundation of the Templars had been forming for far longer than that fateful night. What history often overlooks is the role of the commoners, the very people who had once worshipped the Templars and relied on their wealth, who now began to turn against them. In the years leading up to the arrest, there were whispers across France, murmurs of mistrust, of corruption within the ranks of the order. It was the local peasants who first began to question the Templars' activities, as the once pure order began to shift its focus from pious missions to the accumulation of power and riches. Small groups of disgruntled townsfolk, feeling the weight of the order's increasing greed, began to gather in secret, sharing rumors and suspicions. At first, they were nothing more than a fringe group, but as their numbers grew, so did their influence. These commoners, who had no access to the halls of power, began to feed the flames of distrust, creating an atmosphere of suspicion that would eventually make it impossible for the Templars to survive. What is truly chilling, however, is that their actions were not driven by an overarching political agenda, nor were they inspired by grand ideals. These were ordinary people, many of whom had no idea that their small, insignificant actions were contributing to the downfall of one of the most powerful military orders in history. They were simply trying to survive in a world that was changing around them. In this quiet rebellion, they were no longer content to be pawns in a game they didn't understand. They had begun to feel the crushing weight of an order that had grown too powerful for its own good, and they fought back in the only way they could, through whispers, rumors, and small acts of defiance. The arrest of the Templars wasn't the beginning of their downfall, nor was it the end. It was the culmination of decades of slowly building resentment, fear, and distrust among those who had little power but immense influence in their communities. The power of the common folk, it turns out, was not to be underestimated. They had no armies, no wealth, no high-ranking officials in their pockets, but they had something far more powerful: the ability to spread discontent, to plant seeds of rebellion, and to undermine the foundations of even the most well-established orders. But the Templars weren't alone in this fate. As we look at the Illuminati, for instance, we find similar threads woven into their history. The Illuminati, founded in the late 18th century, was originally a secret society created to promote Enlightenment values and free thought in a world dominated by monarchies and religious dogma. Yet, like the Templars, it quickly grew in power, its members gaining influence in intellectual and political circles across Europe. As the Illuminati's power grew, so did the suspicions surrounding them. Once again, it wasn't just the powerful that sought to destroy them. It was the common people who began to question the motives of those involved. The Illuminati's downfall, much like that of the Templars, came not through some grand betrayal by a high-ranking member but through the subtle erosion of trust from below. As the society's influence spread, it became the target of conspiracy theories and fear-mongering by the public. It wasn't the monarchs who truly brought about their collapse, but the whispers of everyday people who believed that the Illuminati posed a threat to their way of life. What was once seen as an intellectual movement promoting reason and enlightenment became, in the eyes of the masses, a dangerous cabal of elites conspiring to control the world. These fears spread like wildfire, particularly among the uneducated and those outside the intellectual circles where the Illuminati operated. As history has shown time and again, it is often the nobodies, those who have the least to lose, who hold the power to topple the most entrenched systems of power. And yet, the role of these nobodies has remained largely unnoticed, lost in the shadows of history. Their actions may not have been grand or dramatic, but they had a profound impact. They didn't wage wars or write revolutionary manifestos. Instead, they lived their lives quietly and often unknowingly, shaping the course of history in ways that even the greatest minds could not foresee. This isn't a story of great kings or generals, but of ordinary people who, through their resistance to the status quo, became the agents of change. They weren't plotting in the shadows of grand palaces, nor were they sitting in secret chambers drafting plans for world domination. Instead, they were in the streets, in the villages, in the small towns, spreading ideas, challenging the power structures, and pushing back against the forces that sought to control them. They had no armies, no grand strategies, but they had the power of collective action. A power that is often underestimated, but which has the potential to shake the foundations of the world. The story of the downfall of secret societies is not just the story of betrayal from within or the manipulation of powerful men. It is the story of the quiet resistance of ordinary people who refused to be swept aside, who, despite their lack of power, managed to shift the course of history. These nobodies understood something that the powerful often overlook. The true power in society lies not with the elites who rule from above, but with the masses who live below. The power of the nobody sequence lies in the quiet subversion of the status quo, the slow but inevitable erosion of systems of power from the bottom up. As we look back on these events, we must ask ourselves, what if history has been telling us the wrong story all along? What if the key to understanding the downfall of these secret societies and the forces that have shaped the world is not to focus on the powerful, but on the ordinary people whose actions, though small and seemingly insignificant, ultimately brought down the mighty? What if the true power in history lies not in the hands of kings or warriors, but in the hands of those we least expect, the nobodies? This is the mystery we will explore, and the question we will seek to answer. What happens when we begin to look at history not from the top down, but from the bottom up? Throughout history, there have been countless revolutions, movements, and upheavals that have reshaped societies, often with little more than the spark of a single idea igniting the flames of change. But behind every revolution, there's an overlooked truth. The most profound shifts in the course of history rarely come from those at the top. They often emerge from the actions of ordinary individuals, people whose names are not written in the history books, whose voices have been swallowed by the tides of time. These are the nobodies, the common folk whose seemingly inconsequential decisions ripple outward, ultimately contributing to the fall of powerful institutions, the dismantling of great orders, and the alteration of the world as we know it. In the grand narrative of history, the heroes are typically the ones with titles, wealth, and influence: kings, generals, philosophers, and revolutionaries. They are the ones whose actions appear to move history forward. Yet the truth is that for every event that has been set in motion by the elite, there has been an undercurrent of change driven by the unnoticed actions of those far removed from the corridors of power. It is these very nobodies, whose everyday choices, gestures, and reactions can sometimes become the catalysts for massive transformations in history. Imagine, for a moment, the vast network of interconnected lives that make up a society. At its core, there are the powerful, those whose wealth, influence, and status give them the ability to shape the world in dramatic ways. Then, there are the countless others, the merchants, the farmers, the peasants, the workers, people whose names are unknown to history but whose lives form the bedrock of civilization. They are the ones who, more often than not, are seen as passive participants in the grand drama of history. But in truth, their role is far more active than we have been led to believe. The concept of the nobody sequence begins with the understanding that power does not rest solely with the elite. In fact, the true force of change often lies in the collective power of ordinary individuals, those who, in the grand scheme of things, might seem insignificant. These individuals are often the ones who bear the brunt of societal pressures, the poor, the disenfranchised, the marginalized. Yet it is their dissatisfaction, their frustration, and their resistance that creates the conditions for larger shifts in history. Take, for example, the fall of the Knights Templar. It is often depicted as a monumental event caused by the betrayal of high-ranking Templar members, or by the greed and political ambitions of King Philip IV of France. And while these factors certainly played a role, the true downfall of the order came not from the inner sanctums of power, but from the growing discontent among the people they once served. The Templars, once revered as noble knights, were seen as paragons of virtue and military might. Yet, over time, their wealth and power grew so vast that they became a target for envy and suspicion. In the years leading up to their demise, the Templars were no longer viewed as the protectors of pilgrims on dangerous journeys or the humble warriors they once were. Instead, they had become symbols of excessive wealth, political influence, and secrecy, traits that inspired fear and distrust among the common folk. The people who had once relied on the Templars for financial support and protection now saw them as something far more dangerous. An organization whose power was disproportionate to their humility, whose secrecy bred suspicion. But what the Templars and those at the top failed to realize was that their downfall was not just a matter of political intrigue. It wasn't just about the actions of a king or the betrayal of a high-ranking officer. It was about the growing chorus of ordinary people, those whose lives were affected by the Templars' actions, beginning to voice their dissatisfaction. Over time, their whispers became louder. Small rebellions, fueled by resentment and fear, spread through the countryside. Farmers who had once pledged allegiance to the Templars now saw them as an extension of a corrupt system. The peasants, who had suffered under the weight of the Templars' growing power, slowly began to turn against them. It wasn't a grand revolution. It didn't involve armies or banners, speeches or protests. It was, instead, a quiet movement of dissatisfaction. A ripple effect that began in the hearts of ordinary men and women who simply felt the weight of a society in which they had no say. Their opposition was subtle at first, fueled by mistrust, and their actions, though seemingly small, had a profound impact. It was these nobodies who, by questioning the legitimacy of the Templars, by challenging their authority in their daily lives, helped create an environment in which the order could no longer survive. The fall of the Templars is just one example of how nobodies can change the course of history. Throughout time, we see similar patterns emerge, where the dissatisfaction of the common people serves as the impetus for larger societal changes. The Illuminati, for instance, was born in the heart of the Enlightenment, when intellectuals sought to challenge the traditional structures of power. But as the Illuminati grew in influence, so too did the suspicions of the public. Once again, it wasn't the high-ranking members of society who brought about its downfall, but the commoners, the workers, the laborers, the everyday men and women who feared the power the Illuminati might one day wield. The rise of conspiracy theories surrounding the Illuminati is a perfect example of how the nobody sequence works. As the Illuminati's influence spread, it encountered resistance not from monarchs or religious leaders, but from the very people it was supposed to enlighten. The public, especially the lower classes, became increasingly suspicious of the order's intentions. They saw the Illuminati as a hidden cabal, a secretive force that sought to control the world. The fear of this unseen power spread like wildfire, and soon, it wasn't just the elite who feared the Illuminati. It was the common folk, whose voices and actions slowly eroded the order's influence. In this sense, The fall of the Illuminati was not the result of a single dramatic event but the accumulation of countless small acts of resistance. Ordinary people began to question the very foundations of the order's power. They spread rumors, shared stories, and, in doing so, helped create an atmosphere of fear and distrust. Their voices, though small, created a ripple effect that eventually caused the order to collapse under the weight of its own secrecy and suspicion. The same pattern is evident in the decline of other secret societies, whether it's the Freemasons or the countless other organizations that have risen and fallen throughout history. The common thread is the way in which these societies, for all their secrecy and power, are ultimately undermined by the growing distrust of the people they claim to serve. It's not just the power of the elite that determines the fate of these organizations, but the power of the ordinary people who, over time, begin to question and reject them. What is fascinating about this phenomenon is that the nobodies who drive these changes are often unaware of the role they are playing. They aren't plotting grand revolutions or orchestrating complex conspiracies. They are simply living their lives, reacting to the circumstances they find themselves in, and voicing their concerns in whatever ways they can. But over time, these small actions accumulate. The whispers become shouts. The resistance becomes a movement. And eventually, the foundation of even the most powerful institutions begins to crumble. The significance of the nobody sequence goes beyond just these specific historical examples. It speaks to a larger truth about the nature of power and influence. In every society, there is a dynamic between the rulers and the ruled, the powerful and the powerless. We are often led to believe that power resides solely with the elite, that history is shaped by the actions of kings, generals, and philosophers. But the truth is that power is far more diffuse, far more subtle, than we are often led to believe. It lies not just in the hands of the powerful few, but in the collective actions of the many. When we look back at history, it's easy to become fixated on the grand events, the battles, the revolutions, the betrayals that shape our understanding of the past. But these events, dramatic though they may be, are often just the culmination of a much longer process, one that begins with the actions of ordinary individuals who, through their dissatisfaction, their resistance, and their willingness to question the status quo, set in motion the events that will ultimately change the world. The nobody sequence is a reminder that history is not just made by the powerful few but by the countless, nameless individuals who contribute, often unknowingly, to the forces of change. Their actions may seem small in isolation, but together, they create a wave that can reshape the course of history. It's a humbling realization, one that forces us to reconsider how we view power, influence, and the individuals who truly shape the world. In the end, it's not always the most powerful who control history, but the countless voices of the nobodies, whose actions, though small, are never insignificant. At the height of the secret society's power, the world was a vastly different place. It was an era marked by shadows and secrecy, a time when the wealthy and powerful operated behind closed doors, pulling the strings of society from the hidden corners of their influence. These societies, whether it was the Templars, the Freemasons, the Illuminati, or other clandestine groups, held a profound sway over politics, finance, and culture. Their reach extended far beyond the halls of the aristocracy and the vaults of royal palaces. They had infiltrated all levels of society, creating networks of influence that spread across borders and empires. But despite their seemingly indomitable power, they were inherently fragile, resting on foundations that were far less secure than they appeared. What truly lay at the core of their power was not just wealth or political maneuvering, it was the secrecy that surrounded them. The truth was that these secret societies existed in a delicate balance, one that was constantly threatened by the growing restlessness of the people and the eventual unraveling of their own internal structures. In the case of the Knights Templar, the most famous of the medieval secret orders, their strength and reach were built on a combination of military prowess, financial acumen, and religious authority. From humble beginnings during the Crusades, when a small group of knights was formed to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem, the Templars grew to control vast estates, engage in international banking, and wield significant political influence. They had their own castles, fortresses, and strongholds across Europe, and their reputation as fierce warriors and pious monks was unmatched. Over time, they came to symbolize the medieval ideal of chivalry, a blending of the sacred and the martial. They were seen as protectors of the faith and symbols of power and stability. However, as the centuries passed and the power of the Templars grew, so did the resentment and fear they generated. From the outside, the Templars seemed unstoppable. They were a monolithic institution, whose wealth and influence stretched far beyond any other organization of the time. They held secrets, not just about the sacred relics they were rumored to guard, but about their internal workings and the true nature of their operations. The secrecy of the Templars, combined with their immense power, created an aura of mystery that fueled public curiosity and suspicion. They became an enigma, a symbol of both piety and hidden agendas. But secrecy, while powerful, can also be a liability. It is one thing to control information and operate in the shadows when you are secure in your position of power. It is quite another when the balance of power begins to shift. As the Templars' wealth grew, they started to make enemies, both within and outside their ranks. Kings, queens, and the church, those who had once been allies, began to view the Templars' growing influence with increasing concern. The organization's control over financial networks and its independence from secular authorities were seen as threats. Political leaders, particularly King Philip IV of France, who was deeply indebted to the order, began to plot against them, hoping to seize their wealth and dismantle their power. But what often goes unnoticed in the story of the Templars' downfall is the role played by the very people who had once served them. The Templars were not an isolated order existing outside of the fabric of society. They were deeply integrated into the lives of the common folk, who relied on their services, whether it was the Templars' financial institutions or their military prowess. The peasants, the soldiers, the merchants, and the townspeople who interacted with the order on a daily basis were far more than mere witnesses to the Templars' rise and fall. They were active participants, shaping the events that would ultimately bring the Templars to their knees. It was the common folk, through a combination of jealousy, fear, and disillusionment, who played a significant role in eroding the power of the Templars. The Templars had once been seen as heroes, protectors of the Christian faith, and benefactors of the poor. But as their wealth grew, so did their distance from the people they were meant to serve. The commoners began to see the Templars not as allies but as symbols of the corruption of power. They were no longer the humble knights who had fought for God's cause in the Crusades, but a wealthy, secretive, and powerful institution that seemed increasingly removed from the struggles of the everyday person. Whispers began to spread in the towns and villages where the Templars had influence. Some claimed that the Templars were not merely a religious order, but a shadowy, self-interested group with hidden motives. There were rumors of heresy, of secret rituals, of forbidden knowledge that the Templars possessed. And as these rumors spread, they fanned the flames of distrust and fear. The common people, who had once revered the Templars, began to question their true intentions. It was a slow shift, but one that eventually gathered momentum. The power of the people's suspicions, fueled by their growing disillusionment, was a force that could not be ignored. At the same time, the internal dynamics of the Templars began to show signs of strain. Despite their outward unity, there were tensions within the order itself. The higher-ranking knights, who lived in relative luxury and enjoyed the spoils of their success, were increasingly disconnected from the rank-and-file members of the order. The disparity between the elite and the common members of the Templars created resentment within the order, which weakened its cohesion. The loyalty of the lower ranks began to falter, and with it, the Templars' ability to maintain the secrecy and unity that had been central to their power. When King Philip IV's plot against the Templars unfolded, it was not just the betrayal of powerful figures within the order that brought it down. It was the fact that the very foundation of the order had been eroded by the growing mistrust and dissatisfaction of the common people. The public's fear of the Templars' secretive nature, combined with their growing resentment toward their wealth and power, created a perfect storm. The common folk, through their suspicions and whispers, had already begun to undermine the Templars long before the royal decrees were issued. By the time the political elite moved against them, the Templars' fate was already sealed. It was a collapse that had been decades in the making, the result of a long series of subtle, unnoticed shifts in the balance of power. The same dynamic played out in other secret societies. Take, for example, the Illuminati. Founded in the late 18th century as an intellectual and philosophical society, the Illuminati sought to promote reason, secularism, and Enlightenment ideals. The order was formed in secret, with the goal of creating a more rational, just society. But as the Illuminati grew in influence, so too did the fear and suspicion of those outside their ranks. The Illuminati's secretive nature, combined with their growing influence in political and intellectual circles, made them a target for both religious and political authorities. In much the same way as the Templars, the Illuminati were not only undermined by powerful elites, but by the whispers and fears of the common people. It was the ordinary citizens, the farmers, the townsfolk, the laborers, who began to see the Illuminati as a threat. They were no longer seen as an intellectual movement seeking to enlighten society, but as a dangerous conspiracy to control it. These fears spread through pamphlets, rumors, and local gossip, gaining traction among the masses. The public, in turn, began to demand action. The secretive nature of the Illuminati, once a symbol of intellectual rebellion, became a source of suspicion. And as the people grew more fearful, the order's power began to wane. The parallel between the Templars and the Illuminati is striking. In both cases, it wasn't just the political elite who brought about their downfall. It was the rising tide of fear and suspicion from below. The common folk, who had once been the beneficiaries of the society's power, now viewed them as threats. The illusion of invincibility that these orders once enjoyed was shattered by the distrust of those who had little power but whose collective voices were enough to dismantle the foundations of these mighty organizations. At the peak of their power, these secret societies appeared invulnerable. Their members were among the most powerful and influential figures in society, their wealth and influence seemingly unassailable. But beneath the surface, there was a vulnerability that they could not see, one that came from the shifting attitudes of the common people. The secret societies, so focused on maintaining their own power and secrecy, failed to recognize the growing discontent among those they had once protected and served. And it was this discontent, this growing fear and suspicion, that ultimately led to their downfall. In the end, the fall of these secret societies serves as a powerful reminder of the unpredictable and often unseen forces that shape history. The power of the people, the nobodies who are often overlooked in the grand narrative, is far more significant than we have been led to believe. The whispers of the common folk, their fear and suspicion, can have a far-reaching impact, toppling institutions that seem untouchable. This quiet, collective power, though invisible and often unrecognized, has the ability to change the course of history in ways that even the most powerful leaders cannot foresee. The secrecy that once gave these societies their power ultimately became their greatest weakness, and in the end, it was the voices of the nobodies that brought them down. On the night of October 13, 1307, the Knights Templar faced their most terrifying and fateful hour. Across France, a vast network of highly trained warriors, wealthy landowners, and revered religious figures was suddenly and shockingly torn apart by the hand of betrayal. The orders came from King Philip IV of France, who, driven by debt and ambition, conspired with Pope Clement V to strike down the Templars in a move that would leave the order shattered and its members either executed or imprisoned. The timing of the arrests was deliberate. It was to happen in the dead of night, when the Templars were least expecting it, and across all of France in one coordinated sweep. Yet, while the drama of this night is often framed as the culmination of a political plot between monarchs and papal authorities, what is rarely discussed is the crucial role that commoners played in the downfall of the Templars. The true story of the fall of the Templars is not just one of betrayal from within their own ranks or from their political enemies. It is a story of how ordinary people, whose lives were intricately tied to the order, helped set the stage for its destruction. The Knights Templar had once been untouchable. Founded in the early 12th century, the order began with a handful of knights who vowed to protect Christian pilgrims traveling through the dangerous Holy Land during the Crusades. Over time, their mission expanded to include military, financial, and political power. By the time of their fall, the Templars were among the most powerful and wealthy institutions in Christendom, controlling vast tracts of land, commanding fleets, and even functioning as an early banking system that facilitated trade and commerce across Europe. To the common folk of Europe, the Templars were not merely a monastic order. They were the guardians of the faithful, the protectors of their lands, and the keepers of ancient secrets. However, with great power came great suspicion. The Templars' rapid accumulation of wealth and land, combined with their secretive rituals and their independence from local authorities, led many to start questioning their true motives. Over time, their sacred status began to erode, and they were increasingly seen not as the noble defenders of the faith, but as an elitist, out-of-touch organization that had become too powerful for its own good. It was not only kings and priests who started to fear the Templars. The common people, the farmers, merchants, and townsfolk who lived in the shadow of the order's wealth, also began to see the Templars in a different light. At first, the Templars were viewed with admiration and respect by the people they served. They were known for their discipline, their charity, and their religious devotion. Yet, as time passed and the order's wealth grew, cracks began to appear. The Templars, once humble men of faith, had transformed into powerful and wealthy figures who held great influence over both the church and the state. Their lands and estates, previously seen as the means by which they served the people, had become symbols of their opulence and power. For many, the sight of Templar knights riding through their villages, clad in their distinctive white mantles emblazoned with the Red Cross, was a reminder not of their sacred mission but of the growing gulf between the commoners and the powerful elite. Rumors began to swirl about the Templars. Whispers of secret rituals, of dark mysteries hidden behind the closed doors of their castles, began to spread through towns and villages. Some said that the Templars were in league with the devil, that their rituals involved heretical practices and blasphemous oaths. While these rumors were fueled by ignorance and superstition, they nonetheless began to sow seeds of doubt in the minds of ordinary people. To many, the Templars had ceased to be symbols of piety and had instead become emblems of everything that was wrong with a world dominated by unchecked power. The Templars had grown too comfortable, too secure in their position of power. They had forgotten the importance of maintaining the loyalty of the people they had sworn to protect. The peasants, who had once looked up to the knights as noble defenders of the faith, now saw them as something else entirely, a force that took without giving back. In the rural villages where the Templars had once been seen as benefactors, there was now growing resentment. They had taken land, taxed the people, and placed their interests above the needs of those they had sworn to protect. As the wealth of the order grew, so did the resentment among those who were forced to live under the shadow of its influence. It was in this atmosphere of growing suspicion and resentment that King Philip IV of France saw an opportunity. Deeply in debt to the Templars, having borrowed large sums of money from them to finance his war efforts, Philip knew that the vast wealth of the order was a tempting prize. But the real catalyst for his actions came not just from his personal financial problems but from the broader political context. The Templars had become a powerful and independent entity, answering only to the Pope and enjoying immunity from local laws and authorities. This power, combined with the widespread rumors about their activities, made the Templars vulnerable. King Philip saw an opportunity to eliminate a potential threat and seize their wealth for himself. But King Philip's plot would not have succeeded without the support of Pope Clement V. The Pope, who had been under the influence of the French king, gave his blessing to the operation. The arrest of the Templars began in France, where hundreds of knights were arrested in a single night. On the morning of October 13th, the Templars were rounded up, their castles and estates seized, and their members charged with heresy, blasphemy, and a host of other charges. Many were tortured and executed, including the Grand Master Jacques de Molay, who was burned at the stake in 1314. But while the story of the Templars' fall is often framed as the result of a royal conspiracy, it was not simply the king and the Pope who played key roles in their downfall. There was another, more subtle force at work: the growing discontent among the common people. The Templars, despite their great wealth and power, had underestimated the power of the people they had once served. The whispers of suspicion and fear that had spread through the villages were the beginning of a larger wave of unrest. As the order's power grew, the loyalty of the people began to erode. The common folk were not privy to the political machinations of kings and popes, but they were keenly aware of the Templars' increasing dominance. They had witnessed firsthand the rise of an organization that had once promised to protect them but had gradually become a symbol of greed and excess. The Templars had alienated the very people who had helped them rise to prominence, and in doing so, they had sowed the seeds of their own destruction. When the king's orders came to arrest the Templars, the public sentiment was already on his side. The Templars were no longer seen as the noble defenders of Christendom but as a secretive, corrupt organization that had grown too powerful for its own good. The people's growing distrust of the Templars made it easier for the political elites to move against them. The common folk, who had once revered the Templars, now found themselves indifferent to their fate. The seeds of rebellion, planted in the hearts of the peasants and townspeople, had grown into a full-fledged movement that helped bring about the downfall of one of the most powerful orders in medieval Europe. The fall of the Templars is a stark reminder of the power of the people, the nobodies, in shaping the course of history. While the political elite may have been the ones who orchestrated the arrests, it was the growing fear and suspicion of the common folk that made their actions possible. The Templars, once invincible in the eyes of the public, had failed to maintain the loyalty of those they had sworn to protect. And in the end, it was not the king or the pope who brought them down. It was the collective power of the people, whose whispers and suspicions slowly eroded the foundation of the order until it could no longer stand. The story of the Templars is not just the story of a powerful order brought down by the machinations of the elite. It is the story of how ordinary people, through their fear, suspicion, and discontent, played a crucial role in the fall of a great institution. It is a reminder that the power of the nobodies, the common folk, the peasants, the townspeople, is often underestimated. But it is a force that can shape the course of history in ways that even the most powerful rulers cannot foresee. The downfall of the Templars was not just a political event. It was the culmination of a quiet revolution, one that began with the whispers of the people and ended with the collapse of an empire. In the years following the fall of the Knights Templar, Europe was a continent on edge. The collapse of such a powerful and revered order sent shockwaves through the medieval world, but it also set the stage for something more insidious. A shift in the way the common people began to view power. The Templars had been one of the most visible and influential groups of their time, with immense wealth, military strength, and secretive influence. Their sudden downfall, not at the hands of noble knights or the monarchs they had once served, but through a combination of royal greed and public distrust, marked a turning point. The whispers of fear and suspicion that had undermined the Templars became a blueprint for how power could be subverted from below, a lesson that would resonate through the centuries and influence the rise and fall of countless secret societies. In the centuries that followed, secret societies would continue to thrive, their members pulling the strings of political movements, intellectual circles, and even financial networks across the world. But the fall of the Templars, an event so dramatic and thorough, would forever alter the landscape of secret societies, especially in how they viewed the delicate balance between secrecy and the public's perception of power. The Templars, with all their wealth and military prowess, had failed to recognize the growing power of the people's whispers. They had underestimated how fear, suspicion, and even a little bit of distrust could topple empires, even those built on the strongest foundations. The Illuminati, founded in 1776 in Bavaria, emerged in a very different political and social context. While the Templars had been entrenched in the medieval feudal system, the Illuminati came into existence during the Age of Enlightenment, a period of intellectual revolution, political upheaval, and the decline of religious authority. The Illuminati's founders, influenced by ideas of rationalism, secularism, and free thought, sought to create a society that would challenge the established order of monarchies and churches that had held sway for centuries. Their goals were lofty: to foster reason, promote the separation of church and state, and free the human mind from the shackles of religious dogma and superstition. But like the Templars, the Illuminati's ambitious goals and secretive nature quickly made them the target of both the authorities and the public. Despite their seemingly noble intentions, the Illuminati's efforts to remain secret and powerful inevitably led to their downfall. Their members, intellectuals, political reformers, and free thinkers, believed in the righteousness of their cause. However, They failed to recognize the dangers of maintaining such secrecy in a rapidly changing world. The very qualities that had made them appealing to the intellectual elites, their clandestine meetings, their code of silence, and their hidden agendas, became the fuel for public suspicion. And once again, the people who had no direct access to the machinations of the elite became the unwitting agents of the Illuminati's demise. The Illuminati's secrecy, combined with their growing influence, began to feed the paranoia that was already taking hold in Europe. Conspiracy theories, once the domain of the marginalized and the uneducated, now found a wider audience. The Illuminati became the focus of these theories, with rumors spreading that they were plotting to overthrow governments, manipulate world events, and control the fate of nations. This fear, though largely unfounded and based on wild speculation, resonated deeply with the general public. The idea of a shadowy cabal pulling the strings of political events fit neatly into the collective imagination of a world that was struggling to come to terms with the changes brought on by the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. But it wasn't just the Illuminati's secretive nature that made them vulnerable. It was the fact that their rise coincided with a time of tremendous upheaval. The political and social structures that had dominated Europe for centuries were beginning to break down. Kings and aristocrats were losing their grip on power, while revolutionary ideals were beginning to sweep across the continent. The Illuminati, though it had little direct involvement in these upheavals, was seen by many as a symbol of the New World Order, a world in which power was no longer in the hands of kings and clerics but was being seized by secretive groups of intellectuals and philosophers. The people, who had lived under the yoke of monarchies and religious hierarchies for centuries, were now faced with the idea that the same elites they had once fought against were now in control of their fate, albeit in a new and more insidious way. As with the Templars, the Illuminati's downfall was precipitated not by the actions of kings or emperors but by the growing dissatisfaction of the common people. The ordinary citizens, who were largely unaware of the specific activities of the Illuminati but were acutely aware of the political changes around them, became the real threat. The Illuminati's secretive meetings and intellectual circles, once seen as an avenue for enlightened reform, were now viewed with suspicion by the public. The idea that a secret society could hold such influence over world affairs, particularly in the wake of the American and French revolutions, fueled the belief that the Illuminati were a dangerous force that needed to be eradicated. It was in this climate of fear and distrust that the Illuminati were effectively destroyed. The order, once thought to be an intellectual beacon for a new age, was disbanded by the Bavarian government in 1785, but their legacy would not be so easily erased. The idea of the Illuminati lived on, however, not as a benevolent group of intellectuals seeking to liberate humanity, but as a shadowy conspiracy controlling world events from behind the scenes. And while the Illuminati themselves may have disbanded, their impact on world history was far from over. The very idea of a secret society, especially one with global ambitions, became a staple of conspiracy theories, one that would be invoked time and time again by those who saw unseen forces manipulating the course of history. The fall of the Illuminati, much like the fall of the Templars, was a lesson in the fragility of power. Despite their intellectual rigor, their vision of a more enlightened world, and their desire to break free from the constraints of tradition, the Illuminati were undone by the very qualities that had made them powerful. Their secrecy, their elitism, and their perceived manipulation of world events made them a target for those who felt threatened by their growing influence. And in the end, it was the fear and suspicion of the common people, whose lives were most affected by the changes brought on by the Enlightenment, that proved to be their undoing. The story of the Illuminati is not just the story of a group of intellectuals who overestimated their ability to remain hidden and wield influence behind closed doors. It is a cautionary tale about the dangers of secrecy and the unpredictable nature of power. Secret societies, no matter how well-intentioned, are always vulnerable to the perceptions of the masses. Once the common people begin to fear or distrust an organization, no amount of wealth, power, or influence can protect it. The downfall of the Templars and the Illuminati serves as a stark reminder that even the most powerful organizations are at the mercy of the people they seek to control or influence. What these secret societies failed to understand, and what history repeatedly teaches, is that power is not just about what happens behind closed doors. It is not just about the machinations of elites or the manipulation of systems. Power is also about perception, the way the public views and responds to an organization's actions. When that perception turns from trust to suspicion, from loyalty to fear, even the most invulnerable institutions can be brought down. The nobodies, those common folk whose lives are shaped by the decisions of the powerful, may seem powerless in the grand scheme of things. But their voices, their fears, and their suspicions have the power to change the course of history in ways that even the most powerful rulers cannot predict. And in the end, it is the whispers of the nobodies that bring down empires and tear down the seemingly impenetrable walls of secrecy. The Templars learned this lesson the hard way. The Illuminati, too, became a casualty of this same truth. The world of secret societies has often been a world of paradoxes. On one hand, they present themselves as being the keepers of hidden wisdom, guardians of sacred knowledge, and the protectors of lofty ideals that aim to elevate society as a whole. On the other hand, they operate in the shadows, in secret, pulling the strings of power from behind closed doors, often with a self-interest that undermines the very ideals they claim to uphold. This duality, the tension between their proclaimed ideals and their hidden actions, has always been at the core of their downfall. While these organizations may rise to power through secrecy, influence, and intellect, they often fail to recognize that their very secretive nature, combined with their increasing wealth and power, is ultimately what causes their undoing. History has shown time and again that no matter how deeply ingrained the members of these societies are in political and intellectual circles, they are ultimately vulnerable to the forces of suspicion and mistrust among the very people they seek to control or influence. One of the most telling examples of this phenomenon is the rise and fall of the Freemasons. The Freemasons, an organization with roots tracing back to the medieval stonemasons' guilds, became one of the most influential secret societies in the modern world. Their origins were humble, grounded in the craftsmanship of stonework, but over time, they evolved into an organization that played a pivotal role in the intellectual and political revolutions of the Enlightenment. They sought to promote the ideals of reason, morality, and brotherhood, and their membership spanned the intellectual elite, political leaders, and artists of the time. To many, the Freemasons embodied the highest ideals of the Enlightenment, an intellectual movement that championed individual rights, personal liberty, and the pursuit of knowledge. Yet, despite their noble goals and their widespread influence, the Freemasons have never been able to escape the shadow of suspicion. The very secrecy that made them powerful and allowed them to operate across national borders and in various political systems was the same secrecy that fueled conspiracy theories and fears among the general populace. Much like the Templars and the Illuminati before them, the Freemasons were perceived by many as a shadowy organization working behind the scenes to control world events. Their rituals, their use of symbols, and their seemingly exclusive membership, reserved for the political and intellectual elite, created a sense of exclusivity that bred distrust. To those on the outside, the Freemasons appeared to be operating with a hidden agenda, and their ability to maneuver through the complex political and social landscapes of the time only added to the sense that they were working in secrecy for their own interests, not the greater good of society. This sense of secrecy and exclusivity, however, was not limited to the outside world's perception of the Freemasons. Within the organization itself, there was a growing sense of disillusionment among the rank-and-file members. As the organization expanded and became more powerful, the initial ideals of brotherhood and mutual support began to be overshadowed by the realities of political maneuvering and the pursuit of wealth and influence. The common members of the Freemasons, many of whom joined for the sense of camaraderie and the promise of a better society, began to see the organization as something different. It was no longer the idealistic movement they had once believed in. It had become a tool for those already in power to consolidate their influence. This internal fracture within the Freemasons mirrored what had happened to the Templars centuries earlier. The Templars had started as humble monks, warriors in the service of God, but their rapid rise to power led to a sense of separation between their elite leadership and the common knights who had originally sworn to protect the faith. Similarly, as the Freemasons grew, they too became a place where the elite, the wealthy, and the politically connected could strengthen their power. The common members, those who had once hoped to shape a more just and rational society, began to feel like mere tools in the hands of the powerful. This disillusionment, combined with the increasing fears of the public, set the stage for the eventual erosion of the Freemasons' influence. But it was not just internal fractures or the elite's growing influence that made the Freemasons vulnerable. It was the rise of anti-Masonic sentiment, particularly during times of political upheaval. As the Enlightenment gave way to the revolutionary ideals of the American and French revolutions, the Freemasons were viewed by many as the embodiment of the intellectual forces that were challenging the established order. While some Freemasons were indeed at the forefront of revolutionary movements, many were also seen as upholders of the status quo. To some, the Freemasons were simply a more refined version of the aristocracy, a secret society that promised equality and fraternity but ultimately reinforced the power of the elite. This perception created an opening for populist movements to target the Freemasons as part of the broader societal forces that were perceived as oppressive. The anti-Masonic sentiment reached its peak in the early 19th century, particularly in the United States, where the anti-Masonic Party emerged as a political force in the 1820s and 1830s. The rise of this party was not just the result of isolated incidents or individual conspiracies. It was a reflection of growing public dissatisfaction with the concentration of power in the hands of elites, many of whom were Freemasons. The party gained significant traction, with anti-Masonic rhetoric becoming a popular feature in political discourse. The public suspicions about the Freemasons reached a fever pitch, fueled by rumors of their secret involvement in political corruption, financial manipulation, and the control of government institutions. The rise of the anti-Masonic Party marked the first time in American history that a third party had gained widespread support by using the fear and suspicion of a secret society as its rallying cry. The Freemasons were not the only ones to experience the wrath of public suspicion. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, secret societies, whether they were the Illuminati, the Rosicrucians, or other organizations, faced similar challenges. The more powerful these societies became, the more they attracted the attention of those who felt threatened by their influence. The common people, whose lives were shaped by the policies and actions of these secret organizations, began to see them as forces that worked in opposition to their interests. The more power these secret societies accumulated, the more they became the targets of conspiracy theories and public mistrust. The very secrecy that had once been the strength of these societies became their greatest vulnerability. The people who had once trusted in the ideals of these groups began to question their motives and their influence. Fear began to spread that these secret organizations were working not for the greater good, but for their own benefit, hoarding power and wealth at the expense of the common people. In a world that was rapidly changing, with the rise of democracy and the spread of revolutionary ideas, the idea that a hidden elite could control the fate of nations was anathema to the ideals of liberty and equality that were sweeping through Europe and the Americas. As a result, the very secrecy that had once made these societies so powerful began to work against them. The fall of the Templars, the decline of the Illuminati, and the rise of anti-Masonic sentiment in the 19th century all point to a recurring theme in the history of secret societies: the tension between power and perception. No matter how noble the ideals of these groups, once they began to amass power and wealth, they became vulnerable to the growing suspicion of the public. It was not the actions of kings or emperors that brought them down, it was the distrust and fear of the common people. The whispers of the nobodies became louder as the elites and intellectuals who ran these secret societies became more distant and out of touch with the very people they had once sought to elevate. Ultimately, the story of these secret societies serves as a powerful reminder that power is not only about control, influence, and wealth. It is also about perception. The failure of these organizations to recognize the importance of public trust and the ever-growing power of the people's voices led to their downfall. In the case of the Freemasons, the Illuminati, and the Templars, their secrecy, their power, and their elitism were their undoing. The more these societies tried to consolidate power and keep their activities hidden, the more they invited suspicion and distrust. What they failed to realize is that the foundation of their influence rested not just on the power they wielded behind closed doors, but on the trust they inspired among the people. Once that trust was broken, the foundation of their power crumbled, and their once invincible influence was brought to an end. In the end, the people, those nobodies who lived in the shadows of these great organizations, were the ones who truly held the power to determine their fate. The rise of secrecy and the intricate networks of hidden societies across history are often painted with the broad strokes of mysticism and conspiracy, But the reality is far more complex and tragic than many realize. Hidden in the shadows of the most powerful institutions were men and women whose lives were driven not by malevolent intent, but by the desire to build something greater than themselves, to influence the course of history, and to shape the world according to their vision. Yet, in their pursuit of power, these secret societies often overestimated their invulnerability and failed to account for the one factor that would ultimately undo them: the unacknowledged power of the common people. The story of secret societies like the Freemasons, the Illuminati, and the Templars is not merely a tale of the powerful falling at the hands of monarchs or political adversaries. It is the story of how their very secrecy, once their greatest asset, became their most dangerous vulnerability. Over the centuries, the growing perception of these societies as hidden forces manipulating the destinies of nations gave rise to an intense, widespread fear, especially among the common folk who lived under the shadow of their influence. The role of ordinary people in the demise of these organizations is often downplayed in historical accounts, but their collective actions, suspicions, and fears played an indispensable role in dismantling the foundations of some of the world's most powerful secret networks. The Freemasons, for example, have long been an enigma. While many consider them simply a fraternal organization committed to moral and intellectual development, the public's perception has often been far more sinister. Secrecy surrounded the Freemasons from their inception, particularly in their later years, when they became increasingly involved in political and social movements. At their core, the Freemasons were deeply invested in the promotion of reason, the advocacy of civil liberties, and the advancement of education. Their goals seemed lofty, and their membership was often drawn from among the intellectual and political elite. But, as the order expanded, so did the gulf between its ideals and its members' real-world ambitions. While the Freemasons' grand ideals seemed to align with the intellectual currents of the Enlightenment, their increasingly obscure practices and rituals bred suspicion. Their reliance on symbols, their secrecy about the details of their initiation processes, and their associations with powerful political figures left many wondering whether they were truly a force for good or if they were wielding their power for more selfish, clandestine purposes. As the Freemasons grew in size and influence, they began to appear less as an idealistic society working for the common good and more like a network of elites with their own hidden agenda. The seeds of suspicion were planted early on, but they began to truly take root during times of political and social upheaval. The American and French revolutions, both movements that featured key figures who were also Freemasons, brought the group to the public eye. For many, the rise of these revolutions was seen as the culmination of Enlightenment ideals: democracy, freedom, and equality, values that the Freemasons were supposed to uphold. Yet, as these revolutions unfolded, many began to wonder whether the Freemasons were the true masterminds behind the events. Their secrecy, their connections, and their presence in key political positions made them a perfect scapegoat for conspiracy theorists. The average person, whose life was directly impacted by the consequences of these revolutions, began to feel that there was something insidious at play. The revolutionaries' lofty ideals seemed to mask a darker, more controlling force at work. And in this atmosphere of fear, the common people began to see the Freemasons not as the heroes of liberty, but as another form of elitism, working for their own gain rather than the good of the masses. This suspicion was only heightened by the growing number of anti-Masonic movements. By the early 19th century, as tensions continued to rise in Europe and America, anti-Masonic sentiment reached a fever pitch. The idea of a powerful, secretive organization manipulating the course of history was a compelling narrative, one that resonated with a public already on edge from the seismic shifts caused by revolutions, wars, and economic turmoil. Anti-Masonic societies sprang up, fueled by the belief that Freemasons were corrupting the political process, hoarding wealth, and establishing a secret world order. These movements, though often lacking concrete evidence, found fertile ground in the imaginations of the masses, who saw the Freemasons as a tangible embodiment of everything they feared about the concentration of power in the hands of a few elites. What followed was a backlash against secret societies as a whole. The very secrecy that had allowed these organizations to rise to power and maintain their influence became their undoing. Once suspicion took root, it was nearly impossible to erase. In the case of the Freemasons, their public image began to shift from that of an enlightened brotherhood to that of a sinister, all-powerful cabal. The more the people saw them as hidden manipulators, the less they trusted the ideals they espoused. In the end, it wasn't just the political authorities or the monarchs who brought the Freemasons down. It was the growing fears of the public, fueled by years of rumors, whispered suspicions, and the belief that the Freemasons were controlling society from behind closed doors. But the story of secret societies and their downfall goes beyond the Freemasons. The Illuminati, founded in the late 18th century, serves as another perfect example of how the secrecy and ambition of these organizations ultimately led to their demise. The Illuminati were founded by Adam Weishaupt with the intent of promoting Enlightenment ideals, particularly the spread of knowledge, reason, and secularism in a world dominated by monarchy and religion. The group was initially small, but it quickly attracted a wide range of intellectuals, academics, and reform-minded individuals, many of whom sought to challenge the established order. However, as with other secret societies, the more the Illuminati grew, the more they became a symbol of hidden power. Despite their relatively short existence, the Illuminati became the focus of some of the most enduring conspiracy theories in history. In the years following their suppression by the Bavarian government in 1785, the Illuminati were believed by many to have continued their operations in secret, exerting influence over global politics, economics, and culture. The idea that a small group of intellectuals could secretly manipulate world events, such as the French Revolution and the American Revolution, fueled widespread paranoia. The public perception of the Illuminati as an all-powerful and shadowy organization controlling the fate of nations spread quickly, despite the lack of substantial evidence to support these claims. This suspicion was exacerbated by the group's own secretive nature. As with the Freemasons, the Illuminati's reluctance to make their activities public, combined with their growing membership in powerful political and intellectual circles, painted them as an elitist group operating outside of the boundaries of public scrutiny. The more the Illuminati tried to distance themselves from political movements, the more they were seen as involved in every major upheaval of the era. For the common person, the Illuminati became a convenient scapegoat for the uncertainties and fears of a rapidly changing world. The idea that powerful elites were controlling their destinies was a reality that many people were willing to accept, particularly when they could not understand the broader forces at play in the world. In both the case of the Freemasons and the Illuminati, the public's growing fear of secret societies was fueled by their perceived lack of transparency and their increasing political involvement. The masses, often powerless in the face of political or economic forces, turned their suspicions onto these organizations as a way to explain the complex and often baffling changes happening in the world. The rise of conspiracy theories was a natural outgrowth of this fear, and as these theories gained traction, they further fueled distrust of secret societies. The more these organizations tried to keep their activities hidden, the more they invited scrutiny. The lack of public accountability, combined with the growing perception that these societies held too much power, made them easy targets for the fears of ordinary people. But the influence of these nobodies was not limited to their fears and suspicions alone. It also manifested in their ability to organize, to spread information, and to demand accountability from the elites. The growing public sentiment against secret societies was not just the product of paranoia, it was the collective response of a society that was beginning to understand the importance of transparency, of breaking down the walls of secrecy that had long protected the powerful. The people were no longer willing to let secret societies operate unchecked. They were demanding answers, demanding that the invisible forces shaping their lives be brought to light. The collapse of the Illuminati and the diminishing power of the Freemasons in the 19th and 20th centuries highlight a larger trend in the history of secret societies: the growing irrelevance of secrecy in a world where the power of the people was increasingly hard to ignore. In the end, it wasn't the monarchs or the governments who brought these societies down. It was the collective will of the common people, whose voices, once silent, now rang louder than ever before. The fear, suspicion, and distrust that grew in the hearts of ordinary people led to the downfall of these once powerful organizations. The story of secret societies is not just one of power and intrigue. It is a story of how those who hold power often fail to recognize the strength of those who have none. The nobodies, in their whispers and suspicions, have the power to topple the most formidable forces in history. The story of the downfall of secret societies, particularly those like the Freemasons, the Illuminati, and the Templars, often seems to be woven with elements of conspiracy, intrigue, and a sense of inevitable betrayal. These societies, founded on principles of secrecy, power, and the belief in controlling hidden knowledge, were not merely religious orders or intellectual groups, but the embodiment of a desire to shape the future, often at the expense of transparency and openness. As much as they sought to safeguard their influence, these organizations frequently underestimated the profound force of distrust that would eventually unravel their tightly woven webs of secrecy. It wasn't just the monarchs or the church that played a role in their downfall, but the countless nobodies. The ordinary people who became disillusioned with the elitist structures that controlled their lives. The Freemasons, often considered the most enduring of secret societies, provide one of the clearest examples of this dichotomy. With a heritage stretching back to the Middle Ages, they were originally linked to the stonemason guilds of Europe. Over time, they transformed into a fraternal organization, claiming a mission rooted in the spread of knowledge, moral improvement, and civic responsibility. Their ideals resonated deeply with the values of the Enlightenment, particularly those related to reason, liberty, and the separation of church and state. But as they grew in influence, their mystique, along with their secrecy, also grew. Their elaborate rituals, use of symbols, and commitment to guarding their inner workings from the public eye became the very characteristics that fueled suspicions. While the public perception of the Freemasons was one of a noble and progressive society, there was also a lingering suspicion about their true purpose. The fact that their meetings were held behind closed doors and their members were bound by oaths of secrecy created an atmosphere ripe for conspiracy theories. At a time when the French and American revolutions were reshaping political landscapes, the Freemasons seemed to some to be the invisible hands pulling the strings of these world-changing events. There was a deep fear among the common people that these influential men, hiding behind the veil of secrecy, were operating with their own agenda, and that their ideals of liberty and freedom were not as noble as they appeared. This suspicion was only amplified by the fact that many of the intellectual and political elites of the time were Freemasons. Their involvement in the shaping of modern governments, including the creation of the United States Constitution and the ideals behind the French Revolution, cast a long shadow over their true intentions. To the average person, it appeared as though the very individuals who championed democracy and equality were simultaneously forming a hidden, hierarchical network that was shaping the future in ways that bypassed the democratic process. The Freemasons were not just intellectuals or reformers. They were part of an elite club, seemingly above the law, capable of influencing events on a scale far beyond that of the ordinary citizen. In many ways, the Freemasons' downfall began with their own success. The more powerful they became, the more vulnerable they became to the suspicion of those outside their circle. The very people they claimed to help, those who lived under the rule of monarchs, under oppressive social systems, or in impoverished conditions, began to question whether the Freemasons were truly working for the good of the masses. Their exclusivity, their elaborate symbols, and their willingness to remain in the shadows were not only signs of their power, but also indicators of their possible manipulation of power for their own purposes. The rise of the anti-Masonic Party in the early 19th century was a direct response to these growing concerns. This political movement, particularly influential in the United States, sought to expose the influence of secret societies, specifically the Freemasons, in shaping the political and economic systems of the nation. The anti-Masons were not simply a fringe group. They attracted significant numbers of people who felt that their voices were being drowned out by the elite, who, they believed, were operating in secret to control the fate of the country. The Freemasons had grown too powerful and too entrenched within the political system, and the public's growing suspicion turned into a call for accountability. The anti-Masonic movement, though ultimately short-lived in political terms, succeeded in making the Freemasons and their secretive ways a topic of national discourse. It forced the organization to retreat from the public eye, further feeding the narrative that their power was both dangerous and unaccountable. Similarly, the Illuminati, an organization founded in the late 18th century with the mission of promoting Enlightenment ideals and challenging the dominance of church and monarchies, also found itself the target of public suspicion and fear. The group was initially small and composed mainly of intellectuals, but its rapid growth and the ideas it espoused were seen by many as a direct challenge to the established order. The Illuminati's secretive nature, its intellectual elitism, and its perceived ambition to influence political change through subterfuge created an atmosphere of paranoia. What began as a movement aimed at spreading reason and secularism quickly became something far more sinister in the eyes of the public. The group's secret meetings and their increasing presence among political and academic elites were seen by many as evidence of a far-reaching conspiracy to undermine traditional structures of power. As with the Freemasons, the more the Illuminati grew, the more the people began to fear that they were not just advocating for change. They were seeking to control the very destiny of nations. The organization was, in a sense, a mirror of the political revolutionaries of the time, but it was viewed by many as the dark side of revolutionary change, an unseen force attempting to shape the world according to its own vision. This fear of the Illuminati reached its peak after their suppression by the Bavarian government in 1785. Though the organization was officially disbanded, the legend of the Illuminati continued to live on in popular culture. Conspiracy theories about their influence on global events, whether it was the French Revolution or the rise of modern capitalism, persisted for centuries. In fact, it was in the 19th century that the Illuminati became the focal point of a new breed of conspiracy theory that sought to explain everything from political unrest to economic crises through the lens of hidden elites. What was once a small, intellectual society had now become the embodiment of all fears about the concentration of power in the hands of a few. The common people, who had no direct access to the workings of such secret groups, became obsessed with the idea that these societies were secretly controlling their lives. The Illuminati's downfall was, in many ways, a direct consequence of their failure to understand the power of perception. While they may have had lofty ideals, their increasing power and secrecy made them seem like the puppet masters of society, pulling strings from behind the curtain. The more secretive they became, the more they invited suspicion and fear. The public, particularly in times of political instability, saw the Illuminati as a symbol of everything that was wrong with the emerging world order, an order in which ordinary people had little power and powerful elites worked in secret to maintain their control. In a similar vein, the fall of the Templars, an event shrouded in mystery and political intrigue, was also marked by the growing fear of the common people. The Templars, once a noble order founded to protect pilgrims and defend the Holy Land, had become one of the wealthiest and most powerful military organizations in medieval Europe. Their sudden downfall, orchestrated by King Philip IV of France, was not just the result of royal machinations. It was also a consequence of the public's growing disillusionment with their power. The Templars had once been seen as the protectors of the faith, but over time, their immense wealth and influence began to breed resentment. The Templars, like the Freemasons and the Illuminati, had become symbols of elitism and secrecy. As their power grew, so did the suspicion surrounding them. The fact that their members were bound by secrecy, the rumors surrounding their initiation rites, and the widespread belief that they held knowledge of ancient, mystical truths created a sense of fear among the people. The arrest of thousands of Templar knights in a single night, under charges of heresy and corruption, was a direct reflection of this fear. The Templars had grown too powerful, too secretive, and too distant from the common people they were meant to protect. In the end, it was the whispers of the masses, those whose lives were affected by the Templars' actions, that brought the order to its knees. In all of these cases, the downfall of the secret societies was not a result of direct confrontation with powerful kings or monarchs, but of the growing mistrust and fear among the general population. The common people, whose lives were shaped by the power these organizations wielded, became the true agents of their demise. The more these societies tried to shield their actions from the public eye, the more they invited suspicion. And once the public's perception turned against them, their power began to erode. The lesson here is clear. The greatest danger to those in power is not the threat of physical violence or political upheaval, but the erosion of trust. The downfall of the Templars, the Freemasons, and the Illuminati can be attributed to the fact that they failed to recognize the importance of maintaining the trust of the people. While they may have been able to manipulate political structures, accumulate wealth, and gain power behind closed doors, it was the collective will of the people that ultimately toppled them. Secrecy, once their greatest strength, became their greatest weakness, and the nobodies who had once been powerless against these organizations became the force that brought them down. Throughout history, The relationship between secret societies and the common people has been one marked by a delicate balance between power and perception. As these organizations, ranging from the Templars to the Freemasons to the Illuminati, grew in influence and power, they often found themselves at odds with the very people they sought to control or influence. While the upper echelons of society may have been enamored with the mystique and influence these groups wielded, the masses, those who lived their daily lives far removed from the workings of these secret orders, began to view them with suspicion. This tension, built on fear, misinformation, and misunderstanding, was often the seed of their eventual downfall. One of the most significant ways that secret societies fell from grace was through the perception that they were conspiring against the common people. It wasn't necessarily the actions of the societies themselves but the whispers and rumors among the public that did the most damage. Secret societies, by their very nature, were closed off, shrouded in mystery, and often imbued with a sense of elitism. For the masses, who were usually relegated to the fringes of political, economic, and social power, any attempt to control or manipulate events from behind the scenes appeared threatening. And it wasn't just about the actions of these organizations, but the fear of what might be happening without the people's knowledge. The fear of unseen forces shaping the world was as old as time itself, and secret societies, with their elusive rituals and shadowy networks, were the perfect target for that fear. The Freemasons, for instance, became a symbol of everything that was wrong with the unchecked concentration of power. Their origins in the medieval stonemason guilds eventually led them to become an influential fraternal organization, attracting the membership of some of the most prominent intellectuals, politicians, and military leaders of the time. They espoused ideals of moral integrity, personal responsibility, and the betterment of society, and many of their members became key figures in the creation of modern democratic systems. However, as the Freemasons grew in influence, their secrecy and exclusivity, traits that were once seen as part of their charm, became increasingly suspect. To the average person, the notion that a select few were operating behind closed doors to shape national policy or influence political movements didn't sit well. The Freemasons' public image as men of reason and enlightenment began to clash with the growing belief that they were hiding darker, more self-serving intentions. In the 19th century, this growing suspicion reached a fever pitch. The American and French revolutions, both of which had significant involvement from Freemasons, became the perfect backdrop for conspiracy theories to take root. The notion that these revolutions, which sought to overthrow monarchies and create new forms of government, were being orchestrated by a shadowy elite group fed into existing fears of the concentration of power. And as the Freemasons' role in these revolutions became clearer, so did the fear that they might be trying to reshape the world in their image, an image that was not so much about liberty and equality but about consolidating control in the hands of a select few. The public perception of the Freemasons as being part of a vast, shadowy conspiracy was solidified by the rise of anti-Masonic movements. These movements were not just driven by ideological differences or political rivalries. They were fueled by a deep sense of fear and distrust of organizations that operated behind closed doors. The Anti-Masonic Party in the United States, which gained significant traction in the 1820s and 1830s, was born out of a growing concern that the Freemasons were not just a harmless fraternal order, but an influential force manipulating the political system for its own benefit. What began as a fear of the Freemasons eventually expanded to encompass all secret societies, turning these once respected organizations into the targets of suspicion and anger. To the average person, it seemed as though the Freemasons had become more than just a group of like-minded individuals. They had become a political force, working behind the scenes to dictate the course of history. This fear was further amplified by the public's lack of understanding of the Freemasons' rituals and practices. Secret handshakes, elaborate symbols, and veiled references to ancient knowledge created an air of mysticism around the Freemasons that only fueled their reputation as a powerful, hidden force. To the common people, the Freemasons were no longer seen as benevolent reformers, but as an elitist group that operated above the law. And this perception did not occur in a vacuum. It was perpetuated by the media, political rivals, and anyone who stood to gain from exposing the supposed dangers of secret societies. The Freemasons, for all their intellectualism and charitable works, became embroiled in a battle not just for political control, but for public perception. The Illuminati, a secret society founded in the late 18th century with the goal of promoting Enlightenment ideals and challenging religious and political authority, faced a similar fate. Though the group was initially small, it quickly attracted a number of prominent intellectuals and reformers who were eager to challenge the status quo. The Illuminati's goals were grand: to spread rational thought, promote secularism, and encourage the separation of church and state. But their increasing presence in intellectual circles and their secretive nature raised suspicions. As with the Freemasons, the more they sought to remain in the shadows, the more their actions were scrutinized by the public. The Illuminati's reputation was sealed when conspiracy theories began to circulate that they were involved in orchestrating major political events, including the French Revolution. These theories, though largely unfounded, were deeply persuasive to the common people. The idea that a small, secretive group of intellectuals could be behind the tumultuous changes of the time was far more palatable than the idea that these revolutions were the result of broader, more complicated forces. The Illuminati's secrecy, their intellectual elitism, and their perceived control over world events made them the perfect scapegoat for the chaos and upheaval that characterized the 18th and 19th centuries. While the Illuminati's influence was short-lived, disbanded by the Bavarian government in 1785, their legacy lived on in the minds of the public. The perception of them as a secretive, powerful group manipulating global events became a central tenet of conspiracy theories that persisted for centuries. What was initially a small intellectual movement aimed at promoting Enlightenment ideals had transformed in the public imagination into a powerful and dangerous cabal. The very secrecy that had allowed the Illuminati to grow and spread their ideas became their undoing, as the people they sought to influence turned against them. Much like the Freemasons, the downfall of the Illuminati can be attributed not to direct action by monarchs or political authorities, but to the growing fear and suspicion of the common people. As these secret societies expanded and became more powerful, they became targets of resentment for those who felt excluded from their influence. The more powerful and influential these organizations became, the more they seemed like a threat to the average person's ability to have a voice in the affairs of the world. And as these secret societies sought to preserve their influence through secrecy and exclusion, they inadvertently created the very conditions that led to their downfall. The Templars, too, provide a fascinating example of how the suspicion and fear of the common people can bring down even the most powerful organizations. Originally founded as a military order dedicated to protecting Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land, the Templars grew to become one of the wealthiest and most influential institutions in Europe. But as their wealth and power increased, so did the fear and resentment that they provoked. The Templars' secretive rituals, their vast wealth, and their perceived independence from both the church and the monarchy made them a target for conspiracy theories. They were seen by many as a threat to the existing order, and their growing influence was viewed as a sign that they were consolidating power for their own purposes. The downfall of the Templars was not solely the result of political maneuvering by King Philip IV of France, but also the product of a broader public distrust. The people, who had once seen the Templars as protectors of the faith, began to view them as an elitist, self-serving organization. When King Philip accused them of heresy and had them arrested in 1307, it was not just the power of the monarchy that brought the Templars to their knees. It was the growing belief among the common people that the Templars were no longer working for the greater good, but for their own benefit. The Templars had become a symbol of everything that was wrong with the concentration of power in the hands of a few. In the end, the fall of the Templars, the Illuminati, and the Freemasons was not merely the result of political intrigue or royal betrayal. It was the growing fear and distrust of the common people that ultimately led to their downfall. These secret societies, which had once promised to shape the world according to their lofty ideals, were undone not by the actions of monarchs or intellectual elites, but by the perception of the masses. The ordinary people, who had no direct access to the inner workings of these societies, became the most powerful force in determining their fate. Through fear, suspicion, and a growing awareness of the concentration of power, the common people, those nobodies, were able to bring down organizations that seemed invincible. It was not just the actions of kings, but the collective will of the people, that tore down the walls of secrecy and influence, and reshaped history in their wake. In examining the role of the common people in the fall of secret societies, one begins to uncover a fascinating and complex layer of history. It is not always the powerful monarchs, kings, or emperors who were responsible for the unraveling of these organizations, but the whispers of the masses, the collective fears and suspicions of those who were often left behind. Whether it was the Freemasons, the Illuminati, or the Templars, these societies found themselves exposed and eventually destroyed not simply by the actions of those in power, but by the distrust that their secrecy generated among the very people they sought to influence or control. Secret societies, by nature, thrive on mystery and the allure of hidden knowledge. Their rituals, symbols, and hierarchical structures are designed to keep outsiders at bay, fostering an air of exclusivity. In the case of the Freemasons, the secrecy surrounding their meetings, their use of esoteric symbols, and their binding oaths created a sense of intrigue that, for a time, worked to their advantage. They were seen as a fraternity of like-minded individuals dedicated to personal growth and the betterment of society. But as they gained influence, particularly in the political and social spheres, the common people began to notice a shift. These organizations, which once promoted themselves as being of service to all of mankind, began to appear more like exclusive clubs for the elite, wielding power from behind closed doors. This perception of secrecy as a tool for maintaining control bred a sense of distrust among the public. The Freemasons, though involved in the promotion of democratic ideals and social progress, became increasingly viewed as agents of an elite few, hiding their true agendas behind an enigmatic facade. The average person, who had little access to the political power that these societies held, started to feel that their lives were being shaped by invisible forces that had no accountability to the public. They were unable to see the full picture, and in the absence of transparency, fear began to grow. The simple act of secrecy, which had once been a way of protecting the organization, now became its greatest vulnerability. The Illuminati, founded with the goal of promoting Enlightenment ideals, found itself in a similar predicament. Initially a small and intellectual group, the Illuminati attracted members who were well-placed in society's power structures. Their mission was noble, to promote rational thought, secularism, and the breaking of oppressive chains of religious and political authority. However, the group's secretive nature and the increasing number of influential members soon gave rise to rumors and suspicion. The idea that an elite group of intellectuals might be plotting to overthrow the existing political and religious structures was unsettling, especially at a time when Europe was rife with political and social unrest. The Illuminati's efforts to remain hidden only amplified the public's belief that they were secretly controlling events, manipulating political decisions, and steering the course of history. As with the Freemasons, the Illuminati became a symbol of everything that ordinary people feared about concentrated power. The very secrecy that allowed the organization to thrive became the reason for its downfall. The fact that the group was composed of well-educated, influential individuals with lofty ideals made it seem even more dangerous to the public, as if they were the architects of a new world order that operated outside the bounds of transparency and accountability. The more the public learned about the Illuminati, the more they began to distrust them, seeing their intellectualism not as a force for good but as a form of elitism that kept ordinary people in the dark. What fueled these conspiracies further was the growing presence of the Illuminati in the political arena. The group's alleged connections to the French Revolution, a time of tremendous social and political upheaval, cemented its role in the public imagination as a powerful secret society with far-reaching influence. Whether or not the Illuminati were directly responsible for the events of the revolution is a matter of debate, but the mere suggestion that they were connected to such an event allowed conspiracy theorists to frame the organization as the puppet masters behind major world events. The idea that a small group of intellectuals had the power to influence revolutions and overthrow established orders was a powerful narrative that resonated deeply with the common people, who had little agency in the political systems of the time. In many ways, the Illuminati's downfall was sealed not by any external force, but by the public's perception of them as an all-powerful elite. The more the people learned about the Illuminati, the more they began to view them with suspicion and fear. And like the Freemasons, the Illuminati's attempt to protect their secrecy ultimately led to their destruction. They had failed to realize that in a world that was rapidly changing, where information was becoming more accessible, and where people were beginning to demand transparency, their hidden operations could no longer be maintained without backlash. Their fall was not due to political enemies alone, but due to the common people's growing awareness of the concentration of power and their desire to have a say in the events that shaped their lives. The Templars, too, were victims of this cycle of secrecy and suspicion. Originally founded as a military order to protect Christian pilgrims during the Crusades, the Templars eventually became one of the wealthiest and most powerful organizations in medieval Europe. Over time, however, their vast wealth and their ability to operate outside the direct control of monarchs and the Church made them increasingly unpopular. The Templars' secrecy, their impressive military prowess, and their control over vast tracts of land and resources led to fears that they had grown too powerful and were no longer loyal to the authorities that had originally supported them. Their downfall began with the growing resentment of the monarchy, particularly King Philip IV of France, who sought to consolidate power and eliminate any rival sources of authority. But while Philip's political machinations certainly played a role in the downfall of the Templars, it was the common people's perception of the Templars that sealed their fate. The Templars had long been a part of the religious and military establishment, seen by many as protectors of the faith. But as their wealth grew and their influence spread, they became symbols of corruption and greed. The very secrecy that had once protected the Templars' operations and safeguarded their power now became a liability, as rumors and fears about their hidden agendas began to circulate. The public's growing distrust of the Templars reached its peak when King Philip, seeking to eliminate them as a threat, orchestrated a mass arrest of Templar knights in 1307, accusing them of heresy, blasphemy, and other charges. The accusations, many of which were exaggerated or fabricated, fed into the growing belief that the Templars were hiding dark secrets. The fact that they were a secretive and powerful organization only added fuel to the fire. The public, already suspicious of the Templars' wealth and influence, now saw them as a threat to the established order, a group that had grown too powerful to remain unchecked. In many ways, the Templars were a victim of their own success. As they gained power and wealth, they alienated themselves from the common people, whose support they had initially enjoyed. The Templars were no longer seen as protectors of the faithful, but as an elite order that operated outside the bounds of the law. The growing resentment of the people, combined with political rivalries and intrigue, led to the Templars' ultimate downfall. The common people, once their allies, became their accusers, and their once glorious order was torn apart. What these societies failed to understand was that their secrecy, though it may have once been a means of protection, eventually became their undoing. Secrecy breeds suspicion, and in a world where information was becoming more accessible and the power of the people was growing, the masses began to demand transparency. The fear of unseen forces controlling their destinies was a powerful motivator, and the common people, once powerless in the face of these secret societies, began to use their voices to demand accountability. The downfall of the Freemasons, the Illuminati, and the Templars was not simply the result of political machinations or royal betrayal. It was the culmination of a larger societal shift, where the common people recognized their own power and refused to remain in the dark any longer. The trust that had been eroded by secrecy was never restored, and the once immense influence of these secret societies was slowly but surely dismantled by the very forces they had sought to control. The result was a new era, where transparency, accountability, and the power of the masses began to reshape the world in ways that would have been unimaginable to those who had once ruled from the shadows. The unraveling of secret societies is a multifaceted story, one that involves not just power struggles and covert maneuvering among the elite, but also the often overlooked role of ordinary people, the commoners, whose collective actions, beliefs, and suspicions played a crucial part in their demise. The fall of these secret organizations was not a solitary event, but rather the result of a confluence of growing distrust, paranoia, and the slow but sure erosion of the very foundations that had allowed these societies to thrive in secrecy for so long. While it is often easy to focus on the top-down narrative, the betrayals of kings, political elites, or rival factions, there is a far more significant story of how the nobodies, those who had little political power or influence, gradually brought down the mighty secret societies from the ground up. The Freemasons, the Illuminati, and the Templars, each in their own way, failed to realize the extent to which their growing secrecy and exclusivity would eventually lead to their downfall. For the Freemasons, secrecy was both a virtue and a vice. On the one hand, It allowed them to operate under the radar, to make political and social strides without interference from external authorities. In an era when monarchies and the church dominated much of Europe, Freemasonry's discretion allowed its members to navigate political environments more freely, to push for reforms and champion ideals that were often at odds with the powers that be. But as the organization grew in size and influence, so too did the suspicions surrounding it. What had once been a protective cloak now became a suspicious shroud. To the common people, the secrecy surrounding the Freemasons only confirmed their worst fears, that this was an elite group, working for its own agenda, that held an undue amount of power over the destiny of nations. In the early stages of their rise, the Freemasons had been relatively transparent about their ideals, principles that aligned closely with the Enlightenment's ideals of reason, justice, and progress. Their promotion of education, individual liberty, and a more egalitarian society made them attractive to many, particularly in the wake of political upheaval and revolution. However, as the group expanded, especially across Europe and into the Americas, it became clear that their membership was primarily drawn from the elite, the intellectual and political circles of society. While this might have been acceptable at first, as time went on, the Freemasons began to be perceived less as a moral organization working for the greater good and more as a fraternity of powerful men, hidden behind a veil of secrecy and symbolism, manipulating events for their own benefit. This perception was amplified by their involvement in major political events such as the American and French revolutions. While many Freemasons were indeed proponents of democratic ideals, their active participation in these revolutions made them, to the common people, symbols of a deeper conspiracy. The fact that their membership included a host of influential individuals, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, and Marquis de Lafayette, among others, only fueled the perception that the Freemasons were secretly orchestrating these world-changing events for their own advantage. The public, already on edge due to the upheaval of the revolutions, began to view the Freemasons as an organization that, while professing noble ideals, was ultimately interested in consolidating power in the hands of a select few. The more secretive the Freemasons became, the more they invited scrutiny. Their elaborate rituals, the use of arcane symbols, and the mysterious language they used during meetings created an air of mysticism that made them seem like a hidden force manipulating the political and social order. And yet, these rituals and symbols were not inherently nefarious. They were part of the tradition and brotherhood that Freemasonry had built over the centuries. But in a world where information was often limited and rumors spread quickly, the secrecy surrounding the Freemasons became a perfect breeding ground for suspicion. This suspicion found fertile ground in the growing anti-Masonic movements, particularly in the United States in the early 19th century. As the Freemasons grew in influence, so did the voices of opposition. The anti-Masonic Party, which gained significant political traction in the 1820s and 1830s, was not just a fringe group but a mass movement. It gained support from a broad cross-section of the American populace, particularly from those who felt left behind by the political system. The anti-Masons believed that the Freemasons were not just an innocent fraternal organization but an insidious network that controlled politics, banking, and other spheres of influence. To the common people, the Freemasons had become a symbol of the political and social systems that they had come to distrust. The very secrecy that had once been a defining characteristic of the Freemasons' power now turned into their greatest liability. As anti-Masonic sentiment grew, the Freemasons found themselves on the defensive, forced to retreat from the public sphere. The more they tried to distance themselves from political movements and keep their membership and activities private, the more they appeared to be engaged in some form of covert operation. The Freemasons' greatest strength, secrecy, had become their greatest weakness. They had become symbols of an elitism that the common people could no longer tolerate. The once proud ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity now seemed to be obscured by a growing perception that the Freemasons were working to consolidate their own power rather than promote the common good. The Illuminati, founded in 1776 by Adam Weishaupt in Bavaria, was another secret society that became embroiled in similar struggles with public perception. The group was originally established to promote Enlightenment ideals, such as the rejection of superstition, the support of reason and science, and the establishment of a secular state. Like the Freemasons, the Illuminati's goals were noble on the surface, but their secretive nature and their desire to influence political change from behind closed doors made them the perfect target for suspicion. The Illuminati's belief in intellectual elitism and their involvement in radical political movements were seen by many as dangerous. As the group's influence grew, so did the public's belief that they were conspiring to bring down existing power structures, including monarchies and religious institutions, in order to establish a new world order. The Illuminati's secrecy, much like that of the Freemasons, fostered an atmosphere of fear and suspicion. Despite their relatively small size, the group's membership included prominent intellectuals, aristocrats, and political figures, which only reinforced the idea that they were part of an elite, hidden agenda. The more the Illuminati tried to stay in the shadows, the more they were seen as an organization with something to hide. Their rapid growth and involvement in radical political movements, especially during the height of the French Revolution, led many to believe that the Illuminati were the unseen hand behind some of the most significant events of the era. The public's fear of the Illuminati was heightened by the fact that they were an organization built on a foundation of secrecy and exclusivity. The average person, who had little access to the elite circles in which the Illuminati operated, became increasingly suspicious of their motives. The Illuminati were accused of plotting to overthrow governments, influence revolutions, and establish a new world order based on their own intellectual ideals. The public's fear was compounded by the fact that the Illuminati's activities were shrouded in mystery, leaving room for speculation and conjecture. The more they tried to conceal their true intentions, the more they fed the fires of paranoia and suspicion. The Illuminati were eventually banned in Bavaria in 1785, but their legend lived on in the minds of the public. Conspiracy theories about the Illuminati's continued existence persisted for centuries, with many believing that they had merely gone underground, continuing their covert activities to influence world events. The downfall of the Illuminati, much like that of the Freemasons, was not just the result of political suppression but also the result of growing public mistrust. The secretive nature of the Illuminati, their intellectual elitism, and their perceived control over political events made them a convenient scapegoat for the public's fears. The downfall of these secret societies can also be seen as a reflection of the changing social and political landscape of the time. The Enlightenment had ushered in an era of reason, individual rights, and democratic ideals. As these ideas gained traction, the notion that a small, secretive group could wield unchecked power over society became increasingly unacceptable to the common people. The rise of the masses, the spread of revolutionary ideals, and the demand for transparency all contributed to the collapse of these once powerful organizations. What these societies failed to understand was that the common people, those who had once been silent and powerless, were now demanding a voice in the affairs of the world. The secrecy that had protected these organizations for so long was no longer seen as a virtue but as a sign of corruption and elitism. The common people, through their growing political awareness and social activism, were able to challenge the secrecy of these organizations and demand accountability. The Freemasons, the Illuminati, and other secret societies that once held immense power were ultimately brought down not just by the actions of monarchs or rival factions, but by the collective will of the people. This downfall marked the beginning of a new era in which transparency and public accountability became more important than ever before. The once invincible power of the secret societies began to fade as the masses, who had long been excluded from the halls of power, began to recognize their own agency and demand a seat at the table. In the end, it was the people, those who had once been seen as nobodies, who were the true agents of change, bringing down organizations that had once seemed untouchable and forcing society to confront the dangers of unchecked power and secrecy. The collapse of secret societies, particularly those like the Freemasons, Illuminati, and the Templars, is a multifaceted story deeply entwined with the rising distrust of the masses and their evolving awareness of power dynamics in society. As these organizations grew in stature, their initial purposes, often rooted in idealism and the desire for societal improvement, became overshadowed by the secrecy and exclusivity that marked their operations. The very elements that allowed them to grow powerful, secrecy, and even the manipulation of social structures, ultimately played a key role in their downfall. For the common people, who once played little part in shaping the political and economic spheres of their worlds, the idea that such vast and powerful entities operated beyond their knowledge and control became both terrifying and unacceptable. It was the masses, whose perceptions were influenced by whispers, rumors, and conspiratorial ideas that ultimately led to the unraveling of these groups. At first, secret societies like the Freemasons had been seen as benign, even helpful organizations. They provided support, shared knowledge, and sought to improve the welfare of the community. The Masonic lodges, founded on ideals such as fraternity, charity, and moral uprightness, became respected social institutions, particularly in the 18th century. They were places where people of influence and stature could congregate to discuss shared values and strategies for societal improvement. Freemasonry was positioned as a force for good, an organization that espoused the virtues of brotherhood and self-improvement, at least on the surface. But the very ideals they promoted, such as the pursuit of liberty and self-determination, became more complicated as their influence expanded and their practices became increasingly exclusive. Over time, the Freemasons attracted not only intellectuals but also individuals from powerful families, political elites, and those with connections to economic and military power. It was the exclusivity of the group that raised alarms. The very notion that an organization could claim access to ancient secrets and the exclusive right to shape the world order made many uncomfortable. What began as a harmless association among like-minded individuals became, in the eyes of the common people, a powerful network of elites who held the keys to the world's most important decisions, all while operating in secrecy. It was the people outside of these organizations, the farmers, workers, and soldiers, who began to question what was going on behind the closed doors of these Masonic lodges. This growing suspicion was amplified by the increasing participation of Freemasons in political movements. As the 18th and 19th centuries progressed, political revolutions were sweeping through Europe, shaking the foundations of monarchy and aristocracy. The Freemasons, particularly in France and the United States, were seen as active participants in these revolutions. Some of the most influential figures of the American Revolution, including George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson, were members of the Freemasons, further tying the organization to political upheaval. But to the average person, this involvement was alarming. Was the Freemasons' role in these revolutions one of genuine desire for social progress, or was it an attempt to seize control for themselves? The idea of an organization, shrouded in secrecy, manipulating events for their benefit was enough to stoke fears and fuel the growing sentiment that the Freemasons, rather than liberating society, were merely consolidating power in their own hands. The suspicion surrounding the Freemasons deepened in the wake of the French Revolution, a period when conspiracy theories flourished. The revolution, which sought to overthrow the absolute monarchy and end the rule of the aristocracy, was seen by many as a success for the people. However, it was also seen by others as an opportunity for the elites to reassert their power under the guise of radical change. As the revolution unfolded, some theorists began to link the Freemasons to the downfall of the monarchy, accusing the group of being behind the orchestrated chaos. To the common people, the idea that the Freemasons had played a role in this upheaval made sense. It fit with their narrative of a shadowy elite conspiring to manipulate events behind the scenes. What followed was the rise of the anti-Masonic movements in the early 19th century. In the United States, for example, the anti-Masonic party emerged, fueled by widespread suspicion of the Freemasons' influence. The party's leaders, drawing on conspiracy theories that linked Freemasonry to everything from the assassination of political figures to the undermining of religious values, painted the group as a secretive, elitist network that was working to corrupt and manipulate society. The very qualities that had allowed the Freemasons to operate under the radar, secrecy, exclusivity, and a strong internal hierarchy, became the very things that led to their downfall. The people, for the first time, were no longer content to stand by and let such organizations operate in the dark. They demanded transparency, accountability, and a break from the power structures that these secret societies represented. Similar patterns emerged with the Illuminati, an organization founded with high ideals but eventually destroyed by the very forces it sought to manipulate. The Illuminati's mission was ostensibly noble: to promote reason, challenge the status quo, and encourage the separation of church and state. Their ideals, drawn from the Enlightenment, stood in stark contrast to the dogmatic religious institutions and absolute monarchies that had long dominated Europe. But again, it was their secretive nature, combined with the radical political views of some of their members, that became their undoing. The Illuminati, like the Freemasons, grew in influence, attracting intellectuals, aristocrats, and influential political figures. They began to operate in secret, planning to infiltrate and subvert existing power structures. To the common people, this felt like a dangerous conspiracy in the making. While the Illuminati were relatively short-lived, their influence lived on in the minds of the public. Conspiracy theories about their role in historical events, particularly the French Revolution, began to proliferate. They were accused of secretly guiding the revolution, undermining the Catholic Church, and plotting to overthrow monarchies across Europe. These theories were fueled by the same sense of paranoia that had surrounded the Freemasons. The fear of a small group of intellectuals secretly pulling the strings of world events became a common thread in popular discourse. The more the Illuminati operated in secrecy, the more their perceived power grew. They became a symbol of everything that was wrong with the concentration of power in the hands of a few. Just as the Freemasons faced growing public suspicion, so too did the Illuminati. The more secretive their operations became, the more they were viewed as a threat to the common people. Ironically, the secrecy that had allowed them to grow in influence, by avoiding scrutiny and working from behind the scenes, was also what led to their eventual demise. Their efforts to remain hidden only fueled the belief that they were plotting something sinister, something that could undermine the very fabric of society. When the Bavarian government banned the Illuminati in 1785, the group was effectively dissolved, but its legacy lived on in the minds of the people. Conspiracy theories about their continued existence and influence persisted for centuries, further contributing to the mythos surrounding secret societies. The fall of the Templars is another classic example of how the common people's fears and suspicions played a role in the downfall of a powerful secret society. The Knights Templar were originally established as a military order to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. Over time, however, the Templars amassed vast wealth and power, operating across Europe and the Middle East. Their secrecy, their immense wealth, and their military prowess made them a target for both political rivals and ordinary people. To the common person, the Templars' rise to power appeared unnatural, as if they were a law unto themselves, operating independently of the kings, popes, and other religious and political figures of the time. The fall of the Templars was catalyzed by King Philip IV of France, who, in desperate need of money, turned against the order, accusing them of heresy and other crimes. While political and economic factors played a significant role in their downfall, the common people's mistrust of the Templars also contributed. The Templars had become symbols of wealth, power, and secrecy, qualities that were deeply unsettling to the general populace. When King Philip orchestrated the arrest of Templar knights in 1307, the charges against them were based not only on political and economic motivations, but also on the deeply rooted suspicion that they were hoarding power and wealth for themselves. The public, already uneasy with the Templars' privileged position, now saw them as a threat. The very secrecy that had once protected the Templars had now become a weapon used against them. They were accused of practicing dark rituals, engaging in heresy, and plotting to undermine the church and the monarchy. The Templars were condemned not just by the political elite but by the common people, who saw them as a secretive organization that had grown too powerful and too independent. What all of these secret societies had in common was a fundamental failure to realize the consequences of their secrecy. Whether it was the Freemasons, the Illuminati, or the Templars, the lack of transparency created a vacuum that was filled by fear and suspicion. The more these societies worked behind closed doors, the more the public came to believe that they were part of a hidden agenda, one that was working against the interests of the people. The more powerful these groups became, the more they threatened the balance of power. And in the end, it was the common people, the very ones who had been kept in the dark, that brought these societies to their knees. They were the ones who began to demand answers, to question the power structures that had long been invisible to them. Their demand for transparency and accountability ultimately led to the downfall of these once mighty organizations. The story of the downfall of secret societies is not just about the rise and fall of powerful organizations, but about the changing nature of power itself. The collapse of groups like the Freemasons, the Illuminati, and the Templars, among others, reflects a profound shift in the social and political landscape. These organizations, once seen as hidden forces that shaped the world, were undone not merely by their political adversaries, but by the growing awareness and power of the common people. What began as isolated whispers of conspiracy eventually became widespread movements calling for transparency and accountability. At the heart of their fall was the tension between secrecy and the collective demand for visibility, between elitism and egalitarianism. The Freemasons, in particular, serve as a fascinating case study in the way that secrecy can go from being a protective tool to becoming the very thing that brings about an organization's undoing. In their early days, the Freemasons were a relatively harmless society, open only to men of a certain character and standing. They promoted fraternity, moral values, and personal development. To a large extent, they operated on the fringes of society, mostly influencing local communities and providing members with a space to grow and socialize. It was a place for men to bond over shared ideals and to support one another in times of need. But as the group grew, so did its reach and its influence. Freemasonry spread across Europe and into the Americas, attracting not only ordinary men but also those who occupied the upper echelons of society: politicians, military leaders, business magnates, and intellectuals. As these high-profile members entered the fold, the organization began to exert influence over larger political and social spheres. And with this influence came an increasing level of secrecy, a need to protect the organization from the prying eyes of those who might seek to undermine it. The problem, however, was that secrecy and exclusivity, qualities that had once worked in the Freemasons' favor, began to breed suspicion. To the average person, the Freemasons' meetings, their cryptic symbols, and their arcane rituals were nothing more than the trappings of an elite group working behind closed doors. The very notion that these men, many of whom held positions of great power, were sharing secret knowledge, using secret handshakes, and engaging in secret political machinations did not sit well with the public. Rumors began to spread that the Freemasons were not simply a social club, but a shadowy force that controlled events from behind the scenes, influencing the decisions of kings, presidents, and even popes. This growing paranoia was amplified by the political climate of the time. The late 18th and early 19th centuries were marked by widespread upheaval. The Enlightenment had fostered ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity, ideas that the Freemasons had initially espoused. But these ideals were also beginning to clash with entrenched powers. Revolutions were breaking out across Europe and the Americas, and the common people were growing increasingly disillusioned with the old systems of monarchy and feudalism. The Freemasons, with their influential membership and their ties to revolutionary causes, became a target for those who saw them as an elite clique manipulating the masses. In the United States, the Freemasons' involvement in the American Revolution became a point of contention. The fact that some of the most prominent figures in the Revolution, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin, were Freemasons only deepened suspicions. Were these revolutionaries genuinely fighting for the rights of the common people, or were they using the revolution as a means to further their own power? Meanwhile, across the Atlantic in Europe, the French Revolution was shaking the very foundations of society. The revolutionaries, like their American counterparts, were seeking to overthrow an old, corrupt system. But the involvement of Freemasons in the revolution fueled a different narrative. To many, the Freemasons were no longer seen as champions of liberty and democracy, but as covert agents of an elite few, conspiring to reshape the world in their own image. The fact that so many Freemasons were deeply embedded in the revolutionary movement only confirmed to the public that they were pulling the strings behind the scenes. The more the Freemasons tried to distance themselves from the political upheaval, the more they became associated with it. They became symbols of the hidden hand that guided the course of history, operating from the shadows and manipulating events to serve their own interests. As the Freemasons became more embroiled in these political dramas, they began to lose their original purpose. They had started as a fraternal organization, committed to personal development and charitable work. But as they became more politically involved, they attracted enemies, both inside and outside their ranks. In the United States, the anti-Masonic Party began to rise in the 1820s, drawing on the growing public suspicion of the organization. The party's platform was built on the belief that the Freemasons were a corrupt, secretive elite that controlled the nation's politics and institutions. They pointed to the organization's secret meetings, its powerful members, and its exclusionary practices as evidence of its nefarious influence. The more the Freemasons tried to deny these allegations, the more their secrecy seemed to confirm them. The anti-Masonic party quickly gained traction, and by the 1830s it had become a serious political force. The anti-Masonic movement spread quickly across the United States, and soon anti-Masonic sentiment was sweeping through Europe as well. In the face of growing public outcry, the Freemasons attempted to rebrand themselves, downplaying their political involvement and emphasizing their charitable works. But the damage had already been done. To the common people, the Freemasons were no longer an organization dedicated to self-improvement and community service. They were a shadowy elite, using their influence to manipulate the political process and consolidate power. The more the Freemasons tried to resist, the more their secrecy became a liability. They were no longer seen as an innocent fraternal organization. They were viewed as a dangerous cabal, conspiring to control the world. The Illuminati, though much smaller in scale and much more short-lived than the Freemasons, suffered a similar fate. Founded in 1776 by Adam Weishaupt in Bavaria, the Illuminati was created to promote the ideas of the Enlightenment, reason, secularism, and the separation of church and state. Initially, the group sought to attract intellectuals and political reformers who were committed to these ideals. But as with the Freemasons, the Illuminati's secrecy and their radical political views quickly made them targets for suspicion. The very fact that the group operated in secrecy, using cryptic symbols, clandestine meetings, and secret handshakes, made them appear to be a subversive force. They were accused of plotting to overthrow the existing political and religious orders and to establish a new world order based on Enlightenment principles. To the common people, this secretive, intellectual elite represented everything that was wrong with the concentration of power. It was no longer just a matter of philosophical ideals. The Illuminati had become a symbol of a hidden, powerful force operating outside the control of the people. The Illuminati's involvement in radical political movements, particularly the French Revolution, only fueled the conspiracy theories surrounding them. Whether or not they played a direct role in the revolution is still debated, but the mere suggestion that they had a hand in such events was enough to cement their place in popular imagination as the masterminds behind political upheaval. Their growing influence was seen as a direct threat to the old order, and their secrecy only added to the paranoia. The Illuminati's perceived power, combined with their secretive nature, made them a target for those who feared they were manipulating events for their own benefit. In many ways, the Illuminati's downfall mirrors that of the Freemasons. The group was banned in Bavaria in 1785, but its legacy lived on in the minds of the people. The public's fear of the Illuminati persisted long after the group had dissolved. The very secrecy that had allowed the Illuminati to operate without scrutiny had made them vulnerable to conspiracy theories. The more secretive the Illuminati became, the more their power grew in the eyes of the people. What had once been an intellectual movement advocating for reform had become, in the minds of the masses, a nefarious force plotting to overthrow the world's established systems. The fear of this hidden power, operating in the shadows, became so pervasive that the Illuminati's legacy persisted long after their formal existence ended. Similarly, the downfall of the Knights Templar is a testament to the dangers of secrecy. The Templars were originally founded in the early 12th century to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. Over time, however, they amassed vast wealth and power. They operated a network of castles, fortresses, and banking systems, and they became one of the most powerful military orders in medieval Europe. Their secrecy, their immense wealth, and their independence from both church and state made them a target for suspicion. In the early 14th century, King Philip IV of France, who was deeply in debt to the Templars, orchestrated their downfall. He accused them of heresy, blasphemy, and other crimes, and in 1307, he ordered the mass arrest of Templar knights. The charges against them were based largely on political and economic motivations, but they were also rooted in the public's growing distrust of the Templars. The more secretive the Templars became, the more their influence seemed to grow. The public, already uncomfortable with their wealth and power, began to see them as a threat. In the end, it was the common people's fear and suspicion that led to the Templars' demise. The story of the Freemasons, the Illuminati, and the Templars serves as a powerful reminder of the downfall of secret societies throughout history, reveals a complex narrative of secrecy, power, paranoia, and the masses' growing awareness of their own influence in the political and social systems of the time. These organizations, whether the Freemasons, the Illuminati, the Templars, or others, once represented exclusive, hidden realms of power, wielding their influence largely unseen and unchecked by the common people. But as the centuries wore on, a significant shift began to take place, one that would ultimately lead to their demise. As these secret societies expanded their reach and influence, the very secrecy that had allowed them to flourish turned into their greatest liability. The more they retreated into the shadows, the more the public began to distrust them, and in doing so, the seeds of their downfall were planted. This was not a simple story of elite conspiracies or political betrayals. It was a tale of shifting power dynamics, where the common people, once thought powerless, gained the strength to challenge the elite's hidden rule. The Freemasons, for example, began as a fraternal order designed to promote moral behavior and community service. Its members were expected to adhere to principles of charity, integrity, and mutual respect. In the early stages, the Freemasons were largely seen as a benign force, a space where like-minded men could gather and help each other improve. But as the organization grew, it began attracting the attention of political and social elites. Members of royal families, high-ranking military officers, and wealthy merchants sought membership, and with their influence, the Freemasons began to occupy a unique position within society. The group's growing power began to raise eyebrows among the ruling classes and the general public. While their fraternal bonds and charitable acts were commendable, their increasing involvement in politics made their influence seem insidious. The very secrecy that had once protected them now raised suspicion. By the time the Freemasons became entangled in major political movements, such as the American and French revolutions, their reputation had shifted. To many, the Freemasons were no longer just a social organization, but a shadowy group of men working behind the scenes to shape the course of history. The participation of influential figures such as George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, and Marquis de Lafayette in the American Revolution, for example, led to the perception that the Freemasons were playing a key role in the shaping of the New World Order. But while their ideals of liberty, fraternity, and equality aligned with the spirit of the American Revolution, the secrecy surrounding their meetings and rituals led many to believe that these revolutionary figures were not simply fighting for freedom, but were working toward the consolidation of power in their own hands. In France, during the French Revolution, similar suspicions arose. The Freemasons' involvement in the revolution, particularly their support for ideas of republicanism and secularism, further deepened the belief that they were part of a larger conspiracy. Their ability to influence the political landscape, often behind the scenes, made the Freemasons seem less like the champions of freedom they claimed to be, and more like agents of an elite faction seeking to control the outcome of the revolution. As the revolution progressed, the Freemasons found themselves increasingly under scrutiny. The more secretive their operations, the more their perceived role in shaping the political landscape seemed to confirm the fears of the public. By the end of the revolution, the Freemasons had become symbols of political manipulation and elitism in the eyes of many. It was not just the Freemasons who faced such challenges. The Illuminati, founded by Adam Weishaupt in 1776, suffered a similar fate. Like the Freemasons, the Illuminati began with lofty ideals, seeking to promote rational thought, secularism, and intellectual freedom. But their methods, secretive meetings, hidden rituals, and a strong emphasis on intellectual elitism, led to growing suspicions that they were plotting to overthrow existing political and religious orders. Their secrecy made them a perfect target for conspiracy theories, and as their membership grew to include influential intellectuals, aristocrats, and political figures, so did the belief that they were part of a wider, clandestine effort to reshape the world. The Illuminati's involvement in political movements, particularly the French Revolution, became a central point of contention. While their direct role in the revolution is debated, the very fact that many of their members were active participants in these radical events fueled the public's fears. They were accused of using the revolution to further their own interests, orchestrating political upheaval to pave the way for a new world order, one that would place power in the hands of intellectuals and secularists rather than monarchs or religious authorities. The Illuminati's secrecy, their use of symbols and cryptic language, only served to deepen the perception that they were working behind the scenes to manipulate the political situation to their advantage. Much like the Freemasons, the Illuminati's embrace of secrecy ultimately led to their downfall. In 1785, the Bavarian government officially disbanded the Illuminati, but their legacy lived on in the minds of the public, who continued to believe that they were still active, hidden away, and continuing their work of reshaping the world according to their own secretive agenda. The Templars, one of the most storied secret societies in history, followed a similar trajectory. Founded in the early 12th century, the Knights Templar were initially a military order tasked with protecting Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. Over time, they amassed vast wealth and power, operating a network of castles, banking systems, and military strongholds across Europe. Their secrecy, coupled with their immense wealth and independence from both the church and the state, made them a target for suspicion. Like the Freemasons and the Illuminati, the Templars' influence became a matter of public concern. Their wealth and power made them symbols of an elite force working behind the scenes, and as their influence grew, so did the fear that they were part of a larger, hidden agenda. The downfall of the Templars was ultimately orchestrated by King Philip IV of France, who, deeply in debt to the order, saw an opportunity to seize their wealth and power. In 1307, Philip accused the Templars of heresy, blasphemy, and other crimes, and ordered the mass arrest of their knights. The charges against the Templars were politically motivated, but they were also fueled by public suspicion of the order's secrecy and their perceived power. The very fact that the Templars operated outside the control of both the church and the monarchy made them a target for both political and popular ire. Their secrecy, once a protective measure, had now become the very thing that led to their destruction. The charges of heresy and blasphemy, although largely fabricated, played into the larger narrative of fear and distrust surrounding the Templars. In the end, the Templars were disbanded, and their leaders were executed, but their legend lived on, further fueling the myth of secret societies working behind the scenes to control the course of history. What is most striking about the fall of these secret societies is the way in which secrecy itself became their undoing. While these organizations may have initially sought to protect themselves from external forces, whether political, religious, or social, their refusal to be transparent ultimately led to their public downfall. Secrecy, which had once been a tool of protection, became a symbol of elitism and manipulation. The more secretive these groups became, the more the public grew suspicious of their true intentions. It wasn't just the actions of rival factions or powerful rulers that led to the downfall of these societies. It was the increasing demand for transparency and accountability from the masses. The common people, once seen as powerless and uninformed, began to demand a voice in the shaping of society. They were no longer content to remain in the dark, blindly following the actions of powerful elites. The revolutions that swept across Europe and the Americas were a manifestation of this growing desire for transparency and equality. As the people became more politically aware and socially active, their ability to challenge these secret societies grew. The more these societies sought to operate in the shadows, the more they fueled the perception that they were working against the interests of the public. The common people, in turn, demanded to know what was going on behind closed doors. This shift in the balance of power is perhaps most evident in the rise of the anti-Masonic movements in the United States and Europe. As the Freemasons, in particular, became embroiled in political intrigue, their secrecy and exclusivity began to alienate the very people they had once sought to serve. The more the Freemasons tried to downplay their political involvement, the more they appeared to be hiding something. In the United States, the anti-Masonic Party emerged in the 1820s, drawing support from a broad cross-section of the population. The party's platform was built on the belief that the Freemasons were a corrupt, elitist organization that wielded undue influence over the nation's politics. Their secrecy was seen as evidence of their desire to control the levers of power behind the scenes. Ultimately, it was not just the political maneuvering of powerful elites that brought about the downfall of these secret societies. It was the growing awareness and political participation of the masses. The common people, once considered nobodies, had begun to realize their own power. They had learned to question authority and demand transparency. And in doing so, they brought down some of the most powerful organizations the world had ever seen. It was the people, those who had once been excluded from the halls of power, who played the key role in dismantling the very institutions that had once held sway over them. The downfall of the Freemasons, the Illuminati, and the Templars marked the beginning of a new era, one in which transparency, equality, and public accountability became the guiding principles of society. The eventual collapse of powerful secret societies like the Freemasons, the Illuminati, and the Templars represents more than just the disintegration of secretive organizations. It marks the transformation of society itself. As these societies fell, they left behind a deep and lingering question. Why did they unravel? While the forces of political power, ambition, and betrayal certainly contributed, there was another layer to their downfall: the shifting attitudes of the public, particularly the emerging awareness and power of the common people. Over time, the very secrecy that allowed these organizations to thrive became their greatest vulnerability, exposing them to suspicions, rumors, and fears that the world's masses were increasingly unwilling to tolerate. Their decline offers a window into the complexities of power, secrecy, and the shifting balance between elites and the people they once sought to control. The Freemasons, perhaps the most well-known of these societies, provide a striking example of how secrecy, originally a tool of protection and influence, eventually became a liability. The origins of Freemasonry can be traced back to medieval guilds of stonemasons, but by the 17th and 18th centuries, the group evolved into a powerful fraternal organization that spread across Europe and the Americas. At its peak, Freemasonry was seen as an institution that combined spiritual development with social advancement, offering its members a sense of belonging and an exclusive network. But the very success of the organization began to sow the seeds of its decline. As Freemasonry attracted wealthier, more influential members, including monarchs, military leaders, and political figures, it began to blur the line between a philanthropic social club and a powerful, elitist organization with secret ambitions. The growing concentration of power within Freemasonry was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it allowed the organization to exert significant influence over political and social developments, such as the American Revolution and the rise of republicanism in Europe. On the other hand, it created a growing sense of mistrust and suspicion among those outside of the organization, particularly the common people. The very secrecy that made Freemasonry an exclusive society also made it a target for conspiracy theories. The fact that such influential people were gathering in private, discussing matters of politics, philosophy, and power, gave rise to the belief that they were part of a hidden cabal, working to shape the future of society according to their own interests, rather than those of the people. This perception of the Freemasons as a shadowy, secretive force pulling the strings of political events was amplified by the political upheaval of the 18th and 19th centuries. The American and French revolutions, in particular, were seen by many as having been influenced, if not orchestrated, by Freemasons, especially given the involvement of prominent figures like George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, and Marquis de Lafayette. As revolutionary ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity spread across Europe and the Americas, Freemasonry, with its secretive meetings and exclusive membership, began to be viewed with increasing suspicion. The public, particularly in France, saw the Freemasons' involvement in the revolution not as a noble pursuit of freedom, but as an attempt to control the revolution for their own benefit. Their secrecy, rather than being seen as a symbol of trust and camaraderie, became a symbol of elitism and manipulation. The fact that Freemasons were able to exert such significant influence while operating behind closed doors, away from the prying eyes of the public, led many to believe that the organization was working against the interests of the common people. In this way, Freemasonry's secrecy turned against it, creating the very distrust that ultimately led to its downfall. The public, once largely unaware of the organization's inner workings, now saw Freemasonry as part of the ruling elite, seeking to manipulate events for their own gain. The more the Freemasons tried to protect their secrets, the more they appeared to be hiding something. As Freemasonry's power grew, so did the backlash against it. The anti-Masonic movements of the early 19th century, particularly in the United States, represent a critical turning point in the organization's decline. The rise of the anti-Masonic Party, fueled by widespread suspicion and fear of the organization's power, was a direct response to the Freemasons' increasing involvement in politics and society. This movement became a political force in its own right, attracting followers who believed that Freemasonry was an unaccountable, dangerous force undermining democracy and equality. The anti-Masonic Party's platform was based on the idea that secret societies, by their very nature, threaten the principles of transparency and accountability that were central to democratic governance. By shining a light on Freemasonry's secretive practices, the anti-Masonic movement successfully convinced many that the organization was not a benign fraternal club, but a secretive elite seeking to maintain control behind the scenes. The more the Freemasons tried to disavow these accusations, the more their efforts to conceal their activities confirmed the suspicions of the public. Their downfall was not merely a result of political opposition but also of a deeper, broader societal shift in the way people viewed power and secrecy. At the same time, the Illuminati, though short-lived, suffered a similar fate. Founded by Adam Weishaupt in 1776, the Illuminati aimed to promote Enlightenment ideals, reason, secularism, and intellectual freedom, while opposing religious and political oppression. Like Freemasonry, the Illuminati relied on secrecy and exclusive membership to protect its members from the watchful eyes of the powerful institutions they sought to challenge. But this very secrecy, which had served as a shield in the early days of the organization, soon became a source of suspicion and paranoia. The Illuminati's perceived involvement in revolutionary movements, particularly the French Revolution, amplified public fears. Although their actual role in these events is still debated, the idea that a group of intellectuals and elites could secretly influence such a monumental upheaval was enough to fuel conspiracy theories that depicted the Illuminati as masterminds behind global political change. The more the Illuminati tried to maintain their secrecy, the more they were seen as a shadowy force working behind the scenes to undermine established political systems. Their involvement in radical intellectual circles and their perceived role in the revolution created a narrative in which they were not merely reformers, but orchestrators of chaos. This perception, combined with their cryptic symbols, hidden meetings, and secretive rituals, cemented their reputation as dangerous conspirators. As with the Freemasons, the Illuminati's secrecy, rather than protecting them, led to their disbandment. In 1785, the Bavarian government outlawed the Illuminati, but the myths and rumors surrounding them persisted long after their official dissolution. The public's belief in their continued existence, despite their official end, was fueled by the very secrecy that had defined them. Their legacy became one of intrigue, paranoia, and conspiracy, even as their actual influence waned. Similarly, the Knights Templar, once one of the most powerful and revered orders in medieval Europe, fell victim to the same forces. Founded in the early 12th century to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land, the Templars grew into a military and financial powerhouse, operating a vast network of castles, estates, and banking operations. Their secrecy, their wealth, and their independence from both church and state made them a target for both political rivals and the common people. As the Templars' power grew, so did fears that they were accumulating too much influence and operating outside the bounds of the law. Their growing wealth, particularly in the form of loans to kings and monarchs, made them increasingly vulnerable to political and economic pressures. The eventual downfall of the Templars was orchestrated by King Philip IV of France, who, deeply in debt to the order, seized upon rumors of heresy and blasphemy as a pretext to eliminate them. In 1307, Philip arrested many of the order's leaders and accused them of practicing dark rituals, worshipping false idols, and engaging in other heretical acts. The charges, though largely fabricated, were fueled by a growing distrust of the Templars. Their secrecy, once seen as necessary for their protection, became a weapon that turned public opinion against them. The more the Templars tried to defend themselves, the more their secrecy made them appear guilty in the eyes of the people. In the end, the Templars were dissolved by papal decree, and their leaders were executed. However, the myths surrounding them, especially the accusations of hidden treasures and secret knowledge, lived on, further fueling the belief in their hidden influence. The stories of the Freemasons, Illuminati, and Templars serve as powerful reminders of how secrecy, once a tool of empowerment, can become a force of vulnerability. These organizations, by seeking to protect their members from external threats and preserve their influence through hidden means, ultimately made themselves targets of suspicion and fear. In doing so, they laid the groundwork for their own destruction. The common people, once marginalized and excluded from the halls of power, began to realize their own ability to influence the course of history. The increasing demand for transparency, the growing recognition of the power of the masses, and the rise of democratic ideals all contributed to the downfall of these secret societies. As the public's awareness and demand for accountability grew, secrecy became less of a shield and more of a sword that brought these once mighty organizations to their knees. The age-old struggle between elites and the common people had shifted, and in the end, it was the people who emerged victorious. The notion of secrecy as a means of control or protection has always been central to the identity and operation of secret societies. But as these organizations grew in influence and reach, their most defining characteristic, secrecy, became both their greatest strength and, paradoxically, their most significant weakness. The rise and fall of secret societies like the Freemasons, the Illuminati, and the Templars are deeply intertwined with the complex relationship between power, secrecy, and the evolving consciousness of the public. What we witness in the unraveling of these once mighty groups is not just the fall of powerful elites but a transformation in the very way societies perceive authority and accountability. The demise of these organizations is an example of how the very forces that once enabled them to flourish, secrecy, exclusivity, and influence, eventually led to their exposure and collapse, as the people they sought to control began to recognize their own power. The Freemasons, perhaps the most enduring of these secret organizations, began as a guild for stonemasons in medieval Europe. Over time, the group evolved into a fraternal order dedicated to self-improvement, charitable endeavors, and the pursuit of moral values. In the early days, the Freemasons were largely apolitical and primarily focused on mutual support and fellowship. Their activities were relatively benign, centered around the idea of improving oneself through ritual, reflection, and community service. But as the organization grew, particularly during the Enlightenment era, Freemasonry attracted men of influence from the highest echelons of society. Political leaders, monarchs, intellectuals, and military men became members, and with them came the political, social, and financial power that would eventually define Freemasonry's most controversial years. The influx of elite members and their increasing involvement in political and social matters set the stage for the Freemasons' eventual downfall. As the organization expanded across Europe and the Americas, its influence reached unprecedented levels. Freemasonry became a symbol of power and social status. But while it offered its members a sense of brotherhood, it also sowed the seeds of suspicion among the public. The common people, who were largely excluded from such elite circles, began to view Freemasonry not as a harmless fraternity but as a shadowy, secretive force exerting undue influence over political events and decisions. The idea that powerful figures were gathering in secret, discussing matters of state and policy, did not sit well with a growing population that was beginning to demand transparency and accountability. The American and French revolutions marked a turning point for the Freemasons, whose participation in both movements only fueled the perception that they were manipulating events behind the scenes. In America, the involvement of founding fathers like George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson in Freemasonry raised questions about the true nature of the revolution. Were these revolutionaries simply fighting for freedom and democracy, or were they pursuing an agenda that favored the consolidation of power in the hands of the elites? The secrecy surrounding Freemasonic meetings, combined with the influence of these powerful figures, created an air of intrigue and suspicion. To many, it seemed as though the Freemasons were the architects of the New World Order, manipulating the revolution for their own benefit. The ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity that the Freemasons espoused were increasingly seen as a smokescreen for a more insidious agenda. In France, the Freemasons' involvement in the French Revolution exacerbated these concerns. The organization's embrace of Enlightenment ideals, such as secularism and republicanism, aligned with the goals of the revolutionaries. However, their increasing influence over the political landscape, particularly their ties to key revolutionary figures, led many to view them as part of a larger conspiracy to control the revolution for their own gain. The more the Freemasons tried to distance themselves from the political turmoil, the more their secretive nature made them appear guilty of manipulating the course of events. What began as an organization dedicated to fraternity and moral improvement was now viewed by many as a powerful, hidden elite shaping the world in their image. At the same time, the Illuminati, a group founded by Adam Weishaupt in 1776, experienced a similar trajectory. Initially conceived as a society that sought to promote Enlightenment ideals such as reason, secularism, and intellectual freedom, the Illuminati aimed to challenge the oppressive power structures of church and monarchy. But like the Freemasons, the Illuminati's reliance on secrecy and exclusivity soon made them a target for suspicion. The fact that the group was made up of intellectuals, politicians, and influential figures only fueled fears that they were part of a larger, shadowy elite working to overturn the established order. The more the Illuminati attempted to keep their activities hidden from the public eye, the more they fed into the growing belief that they were conspiring to control the course of history. Although the Illuminati was short-lived, officially disbanded in 1785 by the Bavarian government, the legacy of their secrecy lived on. The group's involvement in revolutionary movements, particularly the French Revolution, cemented their place in popular imagination as the hidden masterminds behind political upheaval. Whether or not the Illuminati directly influenced the events of the revolution is still a matter of debate, but the very perception that they were working behind the scenes gave rise to conspiracy theories that depicted them as the puppet masters of history. Like the Freemasons, the more the Illuminati tried to operate in secrecy, the more they became a symbol of a shadowy, controlling elite. Their secretive nature, combined with their perceived role in major historical events, made them a target for both political and popular backlash. The more they were vilified, the more their myth grew, and their disbandment did little to quell the suspicion that they were still at work in the shadows. The Knights Templar, one of the most legendary secret societies in history, suffered a fate remarkably similar to that of the Freemasons and the Illuminati. Founded in the early 12th century to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land, the Templars quickly grew into a powerful military and financial order.